I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my sanity to build a single escape hatch out of my family's financial black hole. I had $28,000 saved in a secure account, every single penny, destined for my dream architectural history program in Florence. But my own mother handed my entire future over to my twin sister just to buy her a shiny status symbol. She actually expected me to just cry, accept it, and keep paying her utility bills like a good little obedient workhorse. Instead, I discovered a secret she was desperate to hide, and I used it to tear her perfect life apart, brick by brick. Here is exactly how the nightmare started. The screen of my phone glared back at me in the dim light of my cramped studio apartment. I sat at my desk, my eyes burning from staring at medical data spreadsheets for the last 14 hours. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was just trying to pay my internet bill. I tapped the blue icon for my banking app, let the facial recognition scan my exhausted face, and waited for the familiar comfort of my savings account to load. I had been working 60-hour weeks as a freelance medical data analyst for 3 long years. I took every overnight shift, every holiday contract, and every miserable data entry job I could find. My savings account was my lifeline. It was supposed to say $28,000. That was the exact tuition and living expense requirement for the Florence program. Instead, the bold black numbers on the screen read $14.50. I blinked. I wiped my eyes, thinking the blue light was playing tricks on my vision. I swiped down on the screen to refresh the app. A little gray circle spun for a second, and the page reloaded. $14.50. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. The air in my apartment suddenly felt thick, heavy, and impossible to breathe. I stood up so fast, my office chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. I started pacing, my bare feet slapping against the floorboards as a cold, terrifying panic washed over my entire body. This had to be a glitch. It had to be a bank error. You hear about these things on the news all the time, massive server crashes that show zero balances for millions of customers. That had to be it. I lunged for my purse on the kitchen counter, knocking over a half-empty mug of stale coffee. The brown liquid spilled across the cheap laminate counter, but I ignored it. I dug my fingers into the leather bag and pulled out my debit card, flipping it over to dial the customer service number printed on the back. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped my phone twice before I could punch in the 10 digits. As the automated system droned on, asking for my account number, a sickening realization began to creep into the back of my mind. When I was 16 years old, I got my first job working the cash register at a local pharmacy. Because I was a minor, my mother, Brenda, had to be listed as a joint account holder to open my checking and savings accounts. I never took her name off. I meant to do it when I turned 18, and again when I turned 21, but life in my family was a constant state of putting out fires. I was too busy paying the overdue electric bills that my mother somehow forgot about. I was too busy covering the property taxes on the family house so we would not get evicted. I was too busy being the reliable, invisible daughter while my twin sister Jessica was praised for simply existing. My mother never put a dime into my accounts, so the thought of her taking anything out never even crossed my mind. She was just a dormant name on a piece of digital paper, or so I thought. The hold music was a cheerful acoustic guitar melody that made me want to scream. I paced from the tiny kitchen to the single window overlooking the street, pressing the phone so hard against my ear that the plastic dug into my skin. After what felt like an eternity, the music clicked off and a polite, slightly bored voice came on the line. The representative introduced himself as David and asked how he could help me. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked. I told him my entire life savings had vanished from my account in the last 24 hours, and I needed to know what system error caused it. I heard the sound of keys clacking through the phone. David asked me to verify my identity, and I rattled off my address, my mother's maiden name, and my date of birth. The clacking stopped. The silence on the other end of the line felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. David cleared his throat. He did not sound bored anymore. He sounded cautious, like he was delivering bad news to a stranger. He told me there was no system error. He explained that a wire transfer for exactly $27,985.50 had been successfully processed just 2 hours ago. I stopped pacing. I stared blankly at the wall, my mind completely blank. I asked him who authorized the transfer, even though the sick feeling in my stomach already gave me the answer. David spoke slowly and clearly. He told me that the joint account holder, Brenda, had walked into a local branch, presented her identification, and authorized an immediate wire transfer. I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked him where the money went. I needed to know what crisis, what massive emergency could have possibly justified my mother draining my entire future without a single phone call. David hesitated, explaining that he could only see the receiving institution, but that the money was wired directly to the corporate account of a local luxury car dealership. My $28,000, my late nights, my missed weekends, my dream of walking through the ancient streets of Florence. All of it was gone. It had not been stolen by a hacker or lost in a computer glitch. It had been taken by my own mother to buy a luxury car. The phone slipped slightly from my sweaty grip. David was still talking, asking if I wanted to dispute the charge or freeze the remaining $14, but I could not hear him over the roaring sound in my ears. I ended the call. I did not cry. The panic evaporated, replaced instantly by a blinding, absolute rage. I grabbed my car keys off the hook by the door. I was going to get my money back. The drive from my cramped city apartment to my mother's sprawling suburban house usually took 45 minutes in evening traffic. I made the trip in 22 minutes. I do not remember stopping at any red lights, and I do not remember the music playing on the radio. All I remember is the burning sensation tightening in my chest and the white knuckle grip I maintained on the steering wheel of my rusty sedan. Every single time I blinked, I saw that glowing digital bank balance burned into the back of my eyelids. $14.50. My entire future wiped out in a single afternoon. I had sacrificed my 20s for that money. While my friends were going out to bars on Friday nights, I was sitting in my dark living room coding medical data until 3 in the morning. I ate cheap noodles for months. I wore sweaters with holes in the sleeves because I refused to spend a single dime on myself. Every deposit into that savings account was a brick in the foundation of my escape plan. Florence was not just a study abroad program to me. It was my chance to study architectural history among the greatest buildings in the world. It was my chance to finally breathe. And my own mother had walked into a bank and stolen it all. I pulled into the pristine neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly manicured by hired landscapers and the houses all looked like they belonged in a luxury real estate magazine. I slammed my heavy foot on the brakes as I reached my mother's long paved driveway. I did not even bother pulling in properly or checking my mirrors. I left my car parked at a crooked, aggressive angle, half on the street and half on the pristine concrete. I shoved the heavy gear shift into park and threw my driver's side door open before the struggling engine even fully died. I hit the ground running, but I did not even make it to the front steps. I froze completely dead in my tracks. There it was. Sitting right in the middle of the wide driveway, gleaming under the amber glow of the evening streetlights, was a brand new pearl-white Tesla Model Y. It still had the temporary paper dealer plates taped to the back window. The car was immaculate and completely out of place next to my rusted-out vehicle, and draped across the curved hood of the expensive machine like she was starring in a high-budget luxury commercial was my twin sister, Jessica. She was wearing a designer silk blouse and holding her expensive phone out on an extended tripod, recording herself. I could hear her fake, overly enthusiastic customer service voice echoing in the quiet suburban air. She was talking to her social media followers about manifesting success and upgrading her real estate brand to attract high net worth clients. She was bragging about the dual motor and the white vegan leather interior. She was quite literally posing on top of my stolen study abroad fund and packaging it as her own hard-earned success. I slammed my car door shut with enough force to rattle the windows of the neighboring houses. The loud metallic crack echoed through the driveway. Jessica stopped her video recording and turned to look at me. She did not look guilty. She did not look panicked. She did not even have the common decency to look ashamed. She just rolled her eyes heavily like I was an annoying neighbor interrupting her important professional photo shoot. I walked straight up to her. My hands were shaking so violently I had to ball them into tight fists at my sides to hide the tremors. I asked her where she got the money for the car. My voice was low, but it was vibrating with a dangerous rage I had never felt before in my entire life. Jessica hopped off the hood of the car, smoothing down her pristine skirt with carefully manicured fingers. She gave an exaggerated, loud sigh and told me to calm down because I was ruining her sunset lighting. She casually flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and said she financed the car and mother just helped her with the necessary down payment. The down payment. $28,000. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, and screamed that it was not mother's money to give. It was my money. It was the money I saved working miserable overnight shifts while she was sleeping in until noon every single day. Before Jessica could even formulate a smug response, the heavy oak front door of the main house swung open. My mother, Brenda, marched out onto the wide front porch. She was wearing her usual expensive cashmere cardigan and a look of deep, profound disappointment. She did not ask me why I was screaming in the driveway. She did not ask me how I was doing or if I was okay. She walked down the brick steps and stood directly between me and Jessica like she was physically protecting a helpless, innocent victim from a raging monster. She looked at me with cold eyes and told me to immediately lower my voice because the neighbors were home and I was causing an embarrassing scene. I completely ignored her command. I pointed a shaking finger at the glaring white car and demanded to know how she could walk into a bank, look a teller in the face, and wire my absolute life savings to a car dealership. My mother crossed her arms over her chest and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh. She looked at me with this perfectly practiced expression of pity mixed with extreme annoyance. She told me that I was blowing things entirely out of proportion as usual. She said Jessica had just received her real estate license and she desperately needed a reliable luxury vehicle to drive her wealthy prospective clients to million-dollar property viewings. She actually looked me dead in the eye and said Jessica needed to look highly successful in order to be highly successful. She called it a necessary career investment. I stared at her in total disbelief. I held up my two hands, shoving them right in front of her face. I forced her to look at my hands. The skin on my fingers was cracked, peeling, and completely dry from constantly typing and sanitizing at the medical data facility. I pointed fiercely to the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes that no amount of cheap drugstore concealer could ever hide. I asked her if she had any concept of what I went through to save that specific amount of money. I told her about the missed meals, the 60-hour work weeks, the sheer bone-deep exhaustion that had become my entire personality over the last 3 years. I told her I was suffocating under the weight of my own life just to buy a ticket out. Then I aggressively pointed at Jessica. Her nails were freshly manicured in a perfect, expensive French tip. Her hair was blown out into flawless golden waves. Her skin was glowing from professional spa treatments. She had never worked more than 20 hours a week in her entire privileged life. She lived completely rent-free in my mother's massive house while I paid their monthly utility bills from my tiny roach-infested studio apartment. I paid their heating bill in the winter so they would stay warm while I slept in multiple sweaters. I asked my mother how she could steal my dream program in Italy just to buy her favorite golden child an electric toy. My mother's face instantly hardened. All the fake maternal pity vanished from her features, replaced by a sharp, nasty glare. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest and told me I was being incredibly selfish and immature. She said I was young and I could just study abroad next year or the year after that. She said family always comes first and I should be incredibly proud to support my twin sister's blooming career. She actually used the word proud. She said I was always so terribly stubborn and unwilling to see the bigger picture of our family's success. She told me the money was just sitting in a joint bank account doing absolutely nothing productive while Jessica had a massive real emergency. A real emergency. That is what she called wanting a shiny new Tesla to impress strangers on the internet. She told me I needed to grow up, act my age, and stop throwing a massive temper tantrum over money that was technically legally in her name too. I stood there frozen, staring at the two women who shared my exact DNA. I realized in that exact horrifying moment that they did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They never had. They saw me as a financial resource. They saw me as a reliable bank account. They could raid whenever they wanted to fund their lifestyle. I felt a hot, painful sting of tears welling up in the corners of my eyes, but I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted metallic blood. I absolutely refused to cry in front of them. I refused to give them the immense satisfaction of seeing me break down in their driveway. Jessica let out a short, high-pitched, condescending laugh. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a heavy metal keyring. It had a faded, cheap plastic keychain attached to it. She tossed the keys through the warm evening air. They hit my chest hard and clattered loudly onto the concrete driveway between my cheap, worn-out sneakers. Jessica smiled a cruel, mocking smile that did not reach her eyes. She pointed her finger down the street to a dented grey car parked illegally by the fire hydrant. It was her old 2008 Honda Civic, the one with the broken air conditioning system and the failing transmission that slipped violently every time you drove over 40 miles an hour. She looked at me with total disgust and told me that since I was so stressed about transportation and money, I could just take her awful hand-me-down. She said it was perfectly fine for getting to my little data entry jobs in the city. She said I should be getting down on my knees and thanking her for giving me a free car instead of acting like a jealous monster. My mother nodded in firm agreement like this was a perfectly reasonable, generous compromise for stealing $28,000 from her own child. I looked down at the dirty keys lying on the concrete. Then I looked at the pristine white Tesla. Finally, I looked directly into the eyes of the two women standing in the driveway. The loud, frantic anger inside my chest suddenly went completely cold and silent. It was no longer a screaming rage. It was a quiet, calculated, absolute certainty. I did not bend down to pick up the keys. I did not say another single word to either of them. I stepped gracefully around my mother and marched straight up the brick porch steps. I pushed the heavy front door open and walked into the house I grew up in. I knew I had a locked box of important legal childhood documents and irreplaceable keepsakes hidden in the closet of my old bedroom. I was going to pack my things and I was going to leave this toxic family behind forever. They thought I was just going to roll over and accept this defeat, but they made a massive, fatal mistake. I was finally free to destroy them. I pushed the heavy front door open and stepped into the air-conditioned quiet of the house I grew up in. The faint smell of vanilla air freshener and expensive wood polish hit my nose. It was a smell that used to mean safety and comfort when I was a little girl. Now it just smelled like a trap. I could hear my mother and Jessica outside in the driveway, still talking loudly over the humming engine of the Tesla. They probably thought I was going to my old room to cry into my pillow and beg for their forgiveness later. That is what the old Maya would have done. But the old Maya died the second I saw that $14 bank balance. I did not walk slowly. I took the carpeted stairs two at a time, my worn-out sneakers completely silent on the thick plush material. I marched straight down the hallway past the family portraits hanging on the wall, pictures of Jessica's high school graduation, pictures of Jessica's sweet 16 party, pictures of my parents smiling on vacation. I was barely in any of them, and I realized now it was not an accident. I reached the door of my old bedroom at the end of the hall. It was smaller than the others, and the walls were still painted the pale yellow color I had chosen when I was 10 years old. I grabbed my old duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet and started throwing my things inside. I did not care about folding anything neatly. I grabbed my winter coat, a few heavy sweaters I had left behind, and a small wooden jewelry box that belonged to my grandmother. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew I had to move fast before they decided to come inside and start lecturing me again. I needed my essential documents. I could not just disappear and start over without my original birth certificate, my social security card, and my passport. I had left them in a small fireproof lockbox in my closet years ago, thinking they were safe here. I tore through the bottom of my closet, pushing aside old shoeboxes and dusty winter boots. The lockbox was gone. I sat back on my heels, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. My mother must have moved it. She had a terrible habit of reorganizing my things when I was not around, claiming she was just tidying up. There was only one other place she kept important documents. I stood up, leaving the half-filled duffel bag on the floor, and crept back out into the hallway. My mother's home office was directly across from the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and slipped inside, holding my breath. The room was perfectly organized with a large mahogany desk taking up most of the space. Behind the desk was a heavy floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelf. On the bottom shelf, hidden behind a row of thick, useless encyclopedias, was the family safe, I dropped to my knees on the soft carpet and reached behind the books, finding the cold metal keypad with trembling fingers. My mother changed the code every few years, but she was not very creative. She always used a combination of our birthdays. I punched in a sequence of 6 numbers, praying silently. A small red light blinked above the keypad, and the safe let out a sharp, high-pitched beep. Incorrect. I tried a different combination using Jessica's birth year first. Another red light, another angry beep. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the small rubber buttons. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force my brain to focus. I tried the year my parents bought the house, followed by my mother's birth month. A green light flashed. The heavy metal handle clicked open with a soft mechanical clunk. I pulled the heavy door open, ignoring the stacks of cash and jewelry boxes sitting on the top shelf. I dug straight to the bottom where my mother kept the bulky file folders. I found a blue plastic folder labeled with my name in her neat cursive handwriting. I pulled it out and flipped it open. Inside was my birth certificate, my social security card, and my blue passport. A massive wave of relief washed over me. I grabbed the documents and went to shove them into my jacket pocket when I noticed something else sitting underneath the blue folder. It was a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed shut and had a large, bold logo printed in the top left corner. It was from a major national mortgage lender. My heart skipped a beat when I read the address window in the center of the envelope. It was addressed directly to me, Maya Bennett. But it was not mailed to my tiny studio apartment in the city. It was mailed here to my mother's house. I stared at the envelope, feeling a sudden heavy dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I did not have a mortgage. I had never applied for a mortgage in my entire life. The only property I owned was a small rundown starter condo I inherited when my father passed away years ago. I rented it out to a nice older couple just to cover the property taxes and basic maintenance. It was paid off completely. There was absolutely no reason for a major mortgage lender to be sending thick sealed legal documents to me. I heard a loud burst of laughter coming from the open window. Jessica was outside showing off the car features. The sound made my blood run cold. I ripped the top of the manila envelope open with my thumb, tearing the thick paper aggressively. I pulled out a massive stack of stapled legal documents printed on heavy formal paper. I flipped past the cover letter and stared at the first page of the contract. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement. I scanned down the page, my eyes jumping wildly over the dense, through legal jargon until I saw the property address. It was my condo, my small inherited starter condo. I flipped to the second page and then the third, my breath catching in my throat. I looked at the principal loan amount printed in a neat little box, $80,000. I sank back onto the soft carpet of the office, clutching the thick stack of papers against my chest. My mind was spinning out of control, trying desperately to process what I was looking at. Someone had taken out an $80,000 loan against my completely paid-off property, but the documents were addressed to me. I quickly flipped to the very last page of the contract where the signature lines were printed. There, sitting on the solid black line designated for the primary borrower, was my name, Maya Bennett, signed in blue ink, but it was not my handwriting. I stared at the loops of the letters, feeling the floor drop out from underneath me. The nightmare had just gotten infinitely worse. I sat frozen on the thick wool carpet of my mother's home office. The heavy manila envelope rested on my lap like an unexploded bomb. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin, and my lungs struggled to pull in enough oxygen. My hands trembled violently as I gripped the thick stack of legal papers. The harsh overhead light of the office illuminated the bold black letters printed perfectly across the top of the very first page. It was a Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement. My eyes kept darting back and forth between the dense legal terminology and the specific property address listed in the absolute center of the document. It was the exact address of my condo, the only thing of true value I owned in this entire world. I stared at the principal loan amount printed in a neat little rectangular box. $80,000. Someone had taken out a massive $80,000 loan against my completely paid-off property. When I was 19 years old, my father passed away from a sudden massive heart attack. He did not leave behind a vast fortune or a sprawling luxury estate. He left behind a small two-bedroom starter condo located on the quiet outskirts of the city. He bought that property years before he ever met my mother, and he kept it entirely in his name as a rental investment. In his final will, he bypassed my mother completely and left the condo solely to me. He always knew my mother openly favored Jessica, and he wanted to make sure I had some kind of permanent safety net in this unforgiving world. The condo was certainly not glamorous. The kitchen appliances were heavily outdated, and the carpets desperately needed replacing. But it was mine. It was completely paid off without a single cent of debt attached to it. I rented it out to a very sweet retired couple whose monthly rent payments perfectly covered the annual property taxes and the basic maintenance fees. It was supposed to be my absolute financial security. It was my quiet, solid guarantee that I would never end up homeless on the street no matter how bad things got. I flipped slowly to the second page of the loan document. The date of origination was listed as exactly 14 months ago. 14 months. My mind aggressively raced backward, trying to remember exactly what was happening in our lives over a year ago. Then the dark memory hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. Last spring, I was working a brutal 80-hour work week, managing a massive complex data migration project for a local regional hospital. I was barely sleeping, eating cheap instant noodles, and constantly stressed out of my mind. My mother had come over to my tiny, cramped city apartment, bringing a cheap plastic container of leftover baked ziti. She sat down at my small, wobbly kitchen table and put on her absolute best performance of a caring, deeply concerned parent. She told me I looked completely exhausted. She said I was working myself into an early grave, and it was breaking her heart to see me struggle so much. Then she made her generous offer. She said I had way too much on my plate, and she desperately wanted to help lighten my heavy load. She volunteered to take over managing all the boring, tedious property paperwork for my condo. She said she would handle the local tax filings, the annual insurance renewals, and the frustrating homeowner association documents. She told me I just needed to forward her the official mail and sign a few basic authorization forms so she could legally speak to the management company on my behalf. I was so incredibly tired and so absolutely desperate for a mother who actually cared about my well-being that I agreed without a second thought. I handed her the keys to my only financial safety net. She did not want to help me. She wanted the collateral. I looked back down at the thick stack of papers resting on my knees. The terrifying realization of what they had actually done began to click together in my brain like the heavy steel tumblers of a massive bank vault door. Over the last 14 months, my mother and my twin sister had quietly drained $80,000 of pure equity out of my inheritance. My mind flashed to all the new expensive designer clothes Jessica had suddenly started wearing last summer. I thought about the luxurious tropical vacations my mother took to resort islands, claiming she found incredible discount deals online. They had been living a lavish, wealthy lifestyle, entirely funded by the secret shadow debt they strapped to my hidden safety net. But the document I was holding in my shaking hands was not just the original loan agreement. It was something much worse. I read the terrifying block of text printed on the third page of the packet. It was a formal legal notice of default. The heavy black words jumped off the page, burning themselves into my memory. The account was severely past due. Multiple monthly payments had been completely missed and ignored. The major national lender was officially threatening immediate foreclosure on the property if the outstanding balance was not resolved. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. If the bank foreclosed on the condo, the innocent retired couple living there would be thrown out onto the street. The property would be seized and auctioned off to the highest bidder. My father's final loving gift to me would be completely destroyed. And worse than that, my personal credit would be permanently ruined, leaving me with a massive, devastating bankruptcy on my record before I even turned 25. I frantically scanned down the page looking for the exact total amount required to bring the fraudulent account current and officially halt the aggressive foreclosure proceedings. The number was printed in bold red ink near the bottom of the threatening letter. $27,985.50. I stopped breathing. The air in the room grew completely still. $27,985.50. That was the exact precise amount of my study abroad fund. That was the exact precise amount my mother wired out of my personal savings account just 2 hours ago. Everything suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The money they stole from my bank account today was never meant to be a simple down payment for Jessica's shiny new Tesla. It was a desperate, calculated cover-up. My mother and sister had drained the $80,000 fraudulent loan completely dry, and they could no longer afford the massive monthly payments. The bank was coming for the condo. If the bank officially foreclosed on the property, the formal legal notices would eventually reach me, and their massive criminal fraud would be completely exposed. My mother would go to federal prison. But today, Jessica wanted to buy her luxury car. She needed to secure high-level vehicle financing from the local dealership. If my mother and sister were tied to a massive fraudulent loan that was actively falling into severe default, the luxury car financing would be instantly denied. The dealership would run a comprehensive credit check and see the massive glaring red flags. Their entire fragile house of cards was about to collapse. They needed a massive lump sum of cash to pay the past due arrears on the shadow debt. They needed to clear the default status just long enough for Jessica to secure her pristine car loan and maintain their fake wealthy facade. And they knew exactly where to get that cash. They looked at the $28,000 I had bled for over 3 years and decided my dream of studying in Florence, Italy was the perfect sacrificial lamb to save themselves from total financial ruin. I sat alone in the quiet home office, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of Jessica laughing outside in the driveway. She was out there right now, posing on the hood of a car, bought with stolen funds, while I sat inside holding the concrete evidence of a massive financial crime committed entirely against me. My mother had looked me directly in the eye and told me I was being selfish. She told me I was throwing a tantrum over money that was just sitting around doing absolutely nothing. She stood on the front porch and defended her golden child, knowing full well she had mortgaged my entire future to do it. The profound, overwhelming sadness I had felt in the driveway completely evaporated. It vanished into thin air, leaving behind a cold, sharp, calculating clarity. I was a professional medical data analyst. My entire career was built on finding tiny, hidden discrepancies in massive, complicated systems and exposing the absolute truth. My mother and my sister thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they had successfully outsmarted the quiet, obedient daughter who always paid the bills and never asked any questions. They truly believed I was too weak and too completely broken to ever fight back against them. But they made a fatal, massive mistake. They left the paper trail completely intact. They left the undeniable evidence sitting right here in the family safe. I carefully folded the thick stack of mortgage documents. I did not put them back in the envelope. I held them tightly in my grip and prepared for war. I dragged my finger across the heavy black ink at the bottom of the final page of the contract. My name was staring back at me, Maya Bennett. It was written in a dark blue ballpoint pen. At first glance, it looked perfectly normal. It looked like the signature I had been using since high school to sign checks and authorize medical data reports. But as I sat there on the floor of my mother's home office, breathing in the stale air of the room, my professional instincts took over completely. My entire career as a data analyst was built on catching microscopic errors that everyone else completely missed. I analyzed complex medical charts for 80 hours a week, looking for tiny numerical discrepancies that could cost a hospital millions of dollars. My eyes were professionally trained to find the lie hidden inside the data. And the lie on this legal document was screaming at me. I held the thick paper closer to the warm glow of the desk lamp. The bright lighting illuminated the deep indentations where the pen had pressed into the paper. That was the absolute first red flag. I am left-handed. When I sign my name, I drag the pen lightly across the page in a fluid, continuous motion. I do not press down hard because it smudges the dark ink on the side of my palm. The person who signed this fraudulent document was entirely right-handed. They dug the sharp tip of the pen so deeply into the heavy paper that I could literally feel the raised ridges on the back of the page. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest as I forced myself to focus on the specific letters. I looked closely at the capital letter M in my first name. My M is always sharp and angular like a harsh mountain peak. The M on this fraudulent mortgage document was completely different. The top arches were incredibly soft, rounded, and overly dramatic. Then my eyes moved to the letter Y. I always end my Y with a straight, sharp line, pulling down aggressively into the bottom margin. But this fake Y had a large, sweeping, flamboyant loop at the very bottom. It was a perfectly practiced, arrogant, massive loop. I felt a sudden, icy chill wash over my entire body. I knew that exact loop. I had seen that exact ridiculous loop every single day of my life for the last 24 years. I saw it on birthday cards. I saw it on high school permission slips. I saw it on the dry erase board in our kitchen. It was Jessica's handwriting, my twin sister. The golden child who was currently posing on the hood of a brand new electric car in the driveway right outside that window. She had actually sat down with a blue pen and practiced forging my signature. I closed my eyes and pictured the horrifying reality of how this twisted event must have happened. I pictured Jessica sitting at this exact mahogany desk right where I was kneeling. I pictured my mother standing right over her shoulder, coaching her through the terrible process. They probably had an old high school yearbook or a cancelled check of mine sitting out as a reference guide. Jessica probably complained that her hand was cramping while she practiced stealing my entire financial future. This was not just a simple case of a toxic family overstepping personal boundaries. This was not just a greedy mother dipping into a joint bank account because she felt unconditionally entitled to her daughter's hard-earned savings. This was a premeditated, highly calculated federal crime. This was felony forgery. This was massive mortgage fraud. My brain rapidly processed the severe legal implications of what I was holding in my shaking hands. You do not just scribble a fake name on a multi-thousand-dollar home equity line of credit and easily walk away. You have to present official government identification. You have to sign the papers in front of a licensed public notary. My mother must have used her extensive network in the local suburban real estate community to find a corrupt notary who was willing to look the other way. She must have heavily bribed someone to legally verify that Jessica was actually me. They orchestrated an elaborate criminal conspiracy to steal $80,000 in pure equity from my deceased father's final gift to me. And they did it all while smiling right in my face and telling me I needed to work much harder to support the family. The sheer magnitude of their cold-blooded betrayal was almost impossible to fully process. They were completely willing to let me go to federal prison for their extravagant spending habits. If the bank foreclosed on my starter condo, the fraud investigators would come straight for me. I would be the one standing alone in a federal courtroom trying to explain why my signature was on a defaulted $80,000 loan. My mother and sister would simply deny everything, act shocked, and let me take the devastating fall. I was so completely absorbed in the terrifying reality of the forged documents that I almost did not hear the sudden sound. It started as a faint rhythmic thumping coming from the bottom of the main staircase. Thump, thump, thump. My blood ran completely cold. It was the distinct heavy tread of my mother's expensive designer heels hitting the hardwood stairs. She was coming inside the house. The muffled voices from the driveway had completely vanished. She must have finished admiring Jessica's stolen car and decided it was finally time to come inside and finish lecturing me about being a selfish, ungrateful daughter. I heard her sharp voice echo down the long hallway. She was calling my name in that demanding tone she always used when she expected absolute total obedience. Maya, come down here right now. We are absolutely not finished talking about your terrible attitude. The heavy footsteps were getting much louder. They reached the top of the carpeted stairs and turned down the hallway directly toward the home office. I had maybe 30 seconds before she opened the heavy door and found me sitting on the floor holding the exact evidence that could send her to a federal penitentiary for the next decade. Panic violently exploded in my chest, but my mind instantly went into pure survival mode. I could not just put the documents back and pretend I never saw them. I needed absolute, undeniable proof to protect myself. I shoved my trembling hand into the front pocket of my denim jacket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were slick with nervous cold sweat as I frantically unlocked the screen and opened the camera application. I laid the massive stack of legal papers perfectly flat on the carpet directly under the bright desk lamp. I hovered my phone over the very first page and tapped the screen to focus the lens. I hit the capture button. The camera let out a Soft digital click. I quickly flipped to the second page. Click, third page. Click. My hands were shaking so badly the images were slightly blurry, so I forced myself to take a deep breath and steady my arms. I took multiple high-resolution photos of the final signature page, ensuring the forged loops of the M and the Y were perfectly captured in the bright light. I took a clear photo of the corrupt notary seal. I took a photo of the menacing foreclosure warning letter with the exact $27,000 demand printed in red ink. I documented every single piece of their massive felony conspiracy. The heavy footsteps were right outside the office door now. I could clearly hear my mother's heavy breathing. I could hear the expensive soft fabric of her cashmere sweater rustling as she walked closer to the brass handle. I grabbed the entire stack of thick legal papers and aggressively shoved them back into the heavy manila envelope. I did not have time to make it look perfect or neat. I pushed the envelope deep into the bottom of the dark metal safe, throwing the blue folder containing my passport and birth certificate right on top of it to hide it. I slammed the heavy steel door of the safe shut. The mechanical locks engaged with a loud, terrifying clunk, just as the brass handle of the office door began to slowly turn. I did not have time to run out into the hallway. She would see me instantly, and she would know exactly what I had been doing in her private space. I spun around and looked at the large glass window directly behind the mahogany desk. It overlooked the dark side yard of the property, leading into a thick row of tall evergreen bushes. I lunged across the room, throwing my entire body weight against the heavy wooden window frame. I quickly unlocked the metal latch and shoved the glass pane upward. The cool evening air rushed into the stuffy office, hitting my sweaty face. The office door cracked open. The bright light from the hallway spilled across the carpet, illuminating the exact empty space where I had just been sitting. I grabbed the sturdy wooden windowsill with both hands and hoisted my body up, swinging my legs over the ledge. I heard my mother gasp sharply as she fully pushed the door open. I did not look back. I let go of the sill and dropped silently into the thick, thorny branches of the dark evergreen bushes, right as her angry voice echoed into the empty room. I landed hard in the thick, wet dirt of the flower bed. The sharp branches of the evergreen bushes tore at my denim jacket and scratched my bare arms. But I did not feel the physical pain. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins like pure gasoline. I scrambled to my feet, keeping low to the ground, and sprinted across the dark manicured lawn toward the street. I heard my mother yelling my name from the open office window behind me, her voice echoing angrily in the quiet suburban neighborhood. She was demanding that I come back inside and face her, but I did not look back. I reached my beat-up gray car and yanked the heavy metal door open, throwing myself into the driver's seat. I shoved the key into the ignition, and the old engine sputtered aggressively before finally roaring to life. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and peeled away from the curb, leaving my mother and Jessica standing in their perfect driveway with their stolen electric car. As I turned onto the main highway, the sky completely broke open. A massive torrential rainstorm washed over the city. The heavy drops pounded against the windshield of my car, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. My broken windshield wipers squeaked violently as they struggled to clear the heavy sheets of water. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. My chest was heaving as I tried to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. They had not just stolen my savings account. They had stolen my name. They had weaponized my identity and placed a massive ticking time bomb inside my financial future. I had nowhere to go. My tiny apartment felt completely unsafe now that I knew my mother had access to my personal documents and my bank accounts. I could not go to the police yet, because I only had blurry photos on my phone, and I knew my wealthy mother would easily spin a story about a confused, stressed-out daughter making false accusations. I needed someone who understood complex financial documents. I needed someone who could see through my mother's flawless, manipulative facade. I needed Naomi. Naomi was my older brother Marcus's wife. She was a fiercely intelligent, no-nonsense African-American woman who intimidated my mother and absolutely terrified Jessica. Naomi did not care about country club memberships, designer handbags, or fake suburban polite smiles. She was a senior forensic auditor for one of the top-tier accounting firms in the country. Her entire highly paid career consisted of hunting down corporate embezzlement, tracking hidden offshore accounts, and dismantling massive financial fraud networks for Fortune 500 companies. She was the smartest, most capable person I knew, and she was the only person in the world I completely trusted right now. Marcus loved our mother, but Naomi always saw right through the toxic dynamics of the Bennett family. She had quietly observed my mother constantly demanding money from me while showering Jessica with expensive gifts. She had kept her professional distance for years to keep the fragile peace for her husband, but I knew she would never tolerate this level of criminal financial abuse. I drove my shaking car through the flooded city streets, hydroplaning slightly on the slick asphalt until I finally reached their quiet residential neighborhood. I pulled into their wide driveway and put the car in park, leaving the engine running for a moment as the rain hammered the metal roof. I did not even grab my purse. I just clutched my phone tightly to my chest and ran through the pouring rain up to their covered front porch. I pounded my fist aggressively against the heavy wooden door, shivering uncontrollably from the freezing rain and the sheer shock of what I had just discovered. A few seconds later, the porch light flicked on and the deadbolt clicked open. Naomi stood in the doorway wearing comfortable dark sweatpants and an oversized college sweatshirt. Her warm brown eyes widened in genuine shock when she saw me standing there, completely soaked to the bone, with wet dirt smeared across my face and bleeding scratches down my arms. She did not ask me if it was raining or if I wanted to come back tomorrow when it was more convenient. She immediately reached out, grabbed my wrist with a strong, firm grip, and pulled me inside the warm, brightly lit hallway. She locked the heavy door behind me, shutting out the raging storm, and wrapped a thick, dry towel around my freezing shoulders. She guided me into their large, modern kitchen and sat me down at the massive marble island. The kitchen was immaculate and smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and expensive candles. Marcus was away on a corporate business trip, so the large house was completely quiet and perfectly safe. She poured me a hot glass of chamomile tea and sat down on the tall wooden stool directly across from me. Her face was completely serious and highly focused. She looked at my trembling hands and the terrified expression on my face and asked me exactly what happened. I took a deep, shaky breath and tried to speak, but the words got caught in my dry throat. I just kept thinking about the $80,000. I kept thinking about the forged signatures, the aggressive foreclosure notices, and the $28,000 they stole today to cover their tracks. I placed my phone flat on the cool marble counter and slid it slowly across the island toward her. I told her to look at the photos in the camera roll. Naomi picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. The very first image was the massive foreclosure warning letter with the $27,000 demand printed in bright red ink. The maternal concern on Naomi's face vanished instantly. Her warm brown eyes narrowed and her posture completely shifted. The caring sister-in-law was gone and the ruthless corporate forensic auditor had officially entered the room. She swiped to the next photo. It was the first page of the home equity line of credit agreement showing the $80,000 principal loan amount attached to my inherited starter condo. She did not gasp or act dramatically shocked like a normal person would. She just analyzed the cold, hard data. She swiped to the next image, zooming in closely on the final signature page. She stared at the blue ink loops of the letter M and the letter Y for a long, quiet moment. She recognized the ridiculous flamboyant handwriting immediately, just like I did. She then zoomed in on the notary stamp, checking the dates and the official seal. She set the phone down gently on the counter and looked me directly in the eyes. Her voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a sharp, dangerous edge that commanded total, absolute respect. She asked me if my mother and Jessica knew that I had seen these exact documents inside the safe. I shook my head and told her I escaped out the window before my mother could find me in the office. I told her about my completely drained savings account and how they stole my study abroad fund to pay the past due arrears so Jessica could get approved for her luxury car loan this afternoon. I told her I was going to call the police and report the theft of my savings first thing in the morning. Naomi reached across the marble counter and grabbed my hands. Her grip was strong and incredibly grounding, stopping my hands from shaking. She told me I could not go to the police tomorrow morning. She explained the criminal justice system with cold, clinical precision. She said if I walked into a local police precinct and complained about a joint bank account, the tired patrol officers would simply dismiss it as a messy civil family dispute. They would tell me to hire an expensive lawyer and handle it in civil court. She said the absolute moment my mother realized I was legally fighting back, she would immediately shred the original mortgage documents hidden in the safe. She would burn the evidence and claim I was making everything up because I was bitterly jealous of Jessica's new car and her real estate career. Naomi did not offer me soft pity. She did not hug me and tell me everything was going to magically be perfectly fine. She offered me a heavily fortified war room. She stood up, walked into her home office, and returned with her professional laptop, a thick yellow legal pad, and 3 different colored pens. She opened the laptop on the kitchen island and looked at me with absolute terrifying clarity, revealing the harsh, brutal truth of my current situation. She said, Maya, if they default on this fraudulent loan, you go to federal prison for mortgage fraud, or you lose the condo and your entire financial future completely. She explained that the bank did not care who actually held the pen and signed the papers. The massive corporate bank only cared that my legal name, my social security number, and my property were permanently tied to the massive debt. She said, we are dealing with highly calculated federal felonies here, including wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that my mother would absolutely throw me to the wolves to save herself and her golden child. Naomi began typing rapidly on her keyboard, pulling up secure financial databases and public property tax records to begin her own shadow audit. She told me we do not just sue them in civil court, and we do not just yell at them in the driveway. We have to completely trap them. We have to build an airtight, ironclad criminal case that the police and the federal financial investigators cannot possibly ignore. We have to force them to confess on the absolute record before they even realize they are caught. The dining room in Naomi and Marcus's house was completely transformed by 2 in the morning. The expensive floral centerpiece had been shoved carelessly to the far end of the massive mahogany table to make room for our makeshift forensic war room. The fierce storm continued to rage relentlessly outside, throwing heavy, violent sheets of rain against the large glass windows. But inside the house, the atmosphere was entirely focused and electric, with a quiet, dangerous energy. Naomi had brewed a massive pot of dark roast black coffee, and the bitter, heavy smell filled the warm air, keeping us intensely awake and completely grounded. She sat at the head of the heavy wooden table, surrounded by her professional accounting tools. She had her sleek silver laptop plugged into the wall, a secondary portable monitor displaying complex financial spreadsheets, and 3 thick yellow legal pads covered in her sharp, precise handwriting. I sat directly next to her, nursing a chipped ceramic mug of hot coffee, feeling completely anchored by her absolute calm authority. For years, I had watched my mother completely dominate every room she walked into. But sitting here next to Naomi, I realized my mother was just a loud bully playing checkers, while Naomi was a grandmaster playing 3-dimensional chess. Naomi did not waste a single second offering empty words of soft comfort or useless sympathy. She knew I did not need a warm shoulder to cry on right now. I needed a sharp weapon. She opened a highly secure encrypted web portal that she utilized for her corporate embezzlement investigations and asked me to type in my social security number. My fingers hovered over the plastic keyboard for a brief, terrifying second before I punched in the 9 personal digits. Naomi hit the enter key, and we waited in heavy silence as the bright screen loaded my comprehensive credit history from all 3 major national reporting bureaus. When the dense wall of financial data finally populated on the glowing monitor, the absolute brutal reality of my mother's betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My previously flawless credit score, the exact score I had meticulously built by paying off my student loans early and never carrying a single credit card balance, had completely plummeted into the ground. There, sitting right at the very top of the active liabilities list, was the massive, glaring $80,000 home equity line of credit. The account status was highlighted in a terrifying bright red color, indicating it was currently in severe delinquency and facing active, aggressive foreclosure proceedings. Naomi leaned in, extremely close to the glowing monitor, her dark brown eyes scanning the complex numerical data with ruthless professional efficiency. She began reading the detailed payment history out loud, her voice completely steady and devoid of any turbulent emotion. She noted that my mother and Jessica had successfully made the required minimum monthly payments for exactly 6 months, right after they forged my signature, before they completely stopped paying altogether. For the last 8 agonizing months, the fraudulent loan had simply sat there, gathering massive amounts of toxic compound interest and heavy late fee penalties. They had drained $80,000 of pure home equity out of my inherited property, spent every single stolen penny of it on their lavish fake wealthy lifestyle, and then completely abandoned the massive debt, leaving my legal name to take the devastating financial impact. Naomi began copying the exact routing numbers, transaction dates, and penalty amounts onto her yellow legal pad, building a flawless chronological timeline of their federal crimes. She worked with the quiet intensity of a surgeon operating on a critical patient. As I sat there watching Naomi methodically dismantle my mother's entire criminal conspiracy, I felt an overwhelming wave of deep, profound gratitude wash over my tired, aching body. Over the last 5 years, Naomi had been a quiet, composed observer of the deeply toxic Bennett family dynamics. When she married my older brother Marcus, she walked right into a chaotic hurricane of my mother's endless emotional manipulation and Jessica's constant entitled, greedy demands. I knew Naomi absolutely despised my mother. I could always see it in the slight, angry tightening of her jaw during agonizing family Thanksgiving dinners, when my mother would relentlessly criticize my modest career choices, while simultaneously praising Jessica for simply existing and looking pretty. I saw the silent judgment in Naomi's eyes when my mother constantly demanded that Marcus pay for expensive family vacations while conveniently excluding me from the travel invitations. But Naomi loved my brother deeply, and she knew that openly attacking his mother would put him in a terrible, impossible position. So she had stayed perfectly quiet for years, biting her tongue heavily and maintaining a polite professional distance to protect her marriage. She tolerated the passive-aggressive comments and the ridiculous suburban family drama because she viewed it as harmless emotional nonsense. But tonight, everything was completely different. Stealing $28,000 from a dormant joint bank account was morally awful, but actively forging government documents and committing massive structural mortgage fraud crossed a massive legal boundary that Naomi would absolutely never tolerate. The heavy velvet gloves were officially off. My mother had unknowingly brought a pathetic, dull knife to a devastating corporate gunfight. Naomi was a senior forensic auditor who regularly dismantled multi-million-dollar international embezzlement rings for a living. Tracking down a sloppy suburban real estate fraud committed by a greedy, arrogant mother and a lazy, newly licensed real estate agent was basically child's play for her. She looked away from the bright computer screen and met my exhausted eyes. She told me she had always known my mother was a deeply selfish, manipulative person, but she never fully realized my mother was capable of being a cold-blooded, calculating criminal. She promised me right then and there, looking across the dark dining room table, that we were not just going to simply get my stolen money back. We were going to legally annihilate them and burn their fake reputation to the ground. Naomi turned her fierce attention back to her professional laptop and began the highly complex, difficult process of tracing the wire transfers. Since I was still technically the primary legal account holder on the recently drained savings account, Naomi was able to use my secure login credentials to bypass the standard banking portal and access the deep internal transaction data. She pulled up the exact digital receipt for the $27,985 transfer that my mother had hastily executed that afternoon. She did not just stop at the receiving bank account listed on the surface-level document. Using her extensive professional knowledge of financial routing systems, she showed me exactly how the stolen money moved through the digital ether. My mother had not wired the money directly to the luxury car dealership. That would have been entirely too simple and way too easy to track for a normal person. Instead, she had wired the stolen funds directly into a secondary, secure escrow account managed by the very same corrupt mortgage lender who currently held the fraudulent home equity loan. Naomi traced the digital paper trail with absolute surgical precision. She explained the entire twisted sick mechanism to me as her black pen flew aggressively across the yellow legal pad. My mother desperately needed to clear the massive past due balance on the fraudulent mortgage immediately because the luxury car dealership had strictly required a comprehensive financial credit check for Jessica's brand new vehicle financing. If the major active foreclosure status hit the public credit bureaus while Jessica was sitting in the dealership finance office, her luxury car loan would be instantly rejected, and their entire fragile, fake wealthy lifestyle would be completely exposed to the public. So my mother ruthlessly stole my exact study abroad fund, wired it directly to the corrupt mortgage lender to clear the delinquent status and essentially reset the fraudulent loan back to a temporarily current standing. Once the severe default status was officially lifted from the banking system, Jessica was immediately approved for the shiny new Tesla financing. They had literally used my blood, sweat, and tears to buy themselves a few more months of fake luxury before the next massive mortgage payment was due. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their criminal plan made me feel physically sick to my stomach. They had sat around their massive, expensive kitchen island, drinking imported wine, and casually plotted to completely destroy my entire future just to maintain their ridiculous social media image. They honestly believed I was too stupid, too blind, and too completely beaten down by years of emotional abuse to ever figure out the complex financial web they had carefully spun. They thought they could just hand me the cheap plastic keys to a broken-down old car and I would quietly drive away and accept my miserable, pathetic fate like a good, obedient scapegoat. They vastly underestimated my intelligence, and they had absolutely no idea what massive storm they had just unleashed by forcing me to run straight into Naomi's house. By the time the first pale grey rays of morning sunlight began to slowly creep through the wet dining room windows, our silent, aggressive audit was completely finished. The thick yellow legal pad was completely filled, edge to edge, with undeniable chronological evidence of severe wire fraud, malicious identity theft, and premeditated felony forgery. Naomi had successfully downloaded every single digital receipt, every microscopic credit report anomaly, and every fraudulent routing number onto a highly secure encrypted portable hard drive. We had successfully mapped out their entire criminal enterprise down to the very last stolen penny. My eyes were burning fiercely from sheer exhaustion, and my entire body ached from the heavy physical toll of the sleepless night. But my mind was completely crystal clear for the very first time in my life. Naomi closed her silver laptop with a soft, satisfying click and leaned back in her heavy wooden chair, stretching her stiff shoulders. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her cold black coffee and looked at me with a fierce, incredibly proud smile. She told me we had the exact absolute proof we needed to destroy them entirely and save my condo. But she quickly reminded me that simply handing this digital evidence over to the local police department was not enough to guarantee a solid criminal conviction. My mother was wealthy, socially connected, and incredibly manipulative. She would immediately hire expensive defense attorneys to drag the legal process out for years, loudly claiming I was a mentally unstable daughter who willingly signed those documents and was now lying purely for jealous revenge. We needed something absolutely bulletproof. We needed them to willingly confess to the crimes on the official record before they even knew the trap was set. Naomi stood up from the dining room table, walked over to the marble kitchen counter, and picked up her phone. She told me it was time to call the one lawyer in the city who was ruthless enough to help us build the perfect legal weapon. The harsh morning light filtered through the dining room windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing over the scattered financial documents. Naomi did not even blink as she dialed the number on her phone. She put it on speaker, setting it down firmly on the marble island between us. The phone rang exactly twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. It was a man, his tone entirely awake and entirely businesslike, despite the early hour. Naomi introduced him to me as Arthur Brooks, though she called him Art. She explained that Art was a former federal prosecutor who had built a massive private practice, completely destroying people who thought they were clever enough to get away with white-collar crime. He was not the kind of lawyer who handled messy suburban divorces or petty traffic tickets. He handled massive corporate fraud, identity theft rings, and complex financial conspiracies. And according to Naomi, he owed her a significant favor from a corporate audit she had helped him untangle a few years ago. Art listened quietly as Naomi laid out the precise details of our night. She did not use emotional language. She gave him the exact dates, the exact loan amounts, the specific routing numbers, and a detailed description of the forged signatures I had photographed. I sat there, gripping my cold ceramic coffee mug, feeling a sudden wave of sheer terror wash over me. Hearing the entire criminal conspiracy spoken out loud to a former federal prosecutor made the horrifying reality of my situation entirely undeniable. When Naomi finally finished speaking, the line was completely silent for a long, heavy moment. Then Art let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver straight down my spine. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of a predator smelling blood in the water. He told Naomi that my mother and sister were incredibly stupid, but unfortunately, their stupidity did not automatically guarantee a clean legal victory for me. Art's voice turned incredibly sharp and serious as he explained the harsh realities of the criminal justice system. He told me that if I simply walked into a local police station right now with the printed photographs of the forged documents, the tired detectives would look at my terrified face, look at the names on the paperwork, and immediately classify the entire situation as a messy civil family dispute. He said my mother Brenda was a wealthy, socially connected woman living in an affluent suburb. If the police knocked on her heavy oak front door, she would not crumble and confess. She would instantly hire a massive team of aggressive defense attorneys who would immediately spin a completely different narrative. They would claim that I was a deeply troubled, jealous daughter. They would say I had verbally authorized the home equity loan to help the family, but was now maliciously lying to the authorities because I was angry that my sister Jessica bought a luxury car instead of paying for my study abroad program. Art explained that because my name was already legally tied to the joint bank account, where the $28,000 was held, my mother could easily argue that she was just managing our shared family finances. And as for the forged mortgage documents, my mother would simply say that I signed them myself, and she had absolutely no idea why the signature looked slightly different. She would blame the notary, she would blame the bank, and she would heavily blame me. Art told me that forgery cases without a direct airtight confession or video evidence were incredibly difficult to prosecute, especially when the suspect was a direct family member with deep financial ties to the victim. He said the bank did not care about family drama. The bank only cared that my name was on the defaulted $80,000 loan. If we went to the police right now and my mother denied everything, the bank would continue the aggressive foreclosure proceedings against my condo while the criminal investigation slowly dragged out for years in the courts. I would lose my property, I would lose my credit, and my mother would likely walk away completely free. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly thin again. I looked at Naomi, my eyes wide with rising panic. I asked Art exactly what I was supposed to do. I asked him how I could possibly prove that I did not sign those papers when my own mother was perfectly willing to sit in a federal courtroom and lie directly to a judge to protect her golden child. Art did not hesitate. His voice was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of any sympathy. He told me we had to completely remove the he said, she said element from the equation. We had to completely strip my mother of her ability to lie. He said the only way to guarantee a swift, brutal felony conviction and absolutely clear my legal name from the massive shadow debt was to secure a direct, undeniable confession. We needed Brenda and Jessica to admit to the forgery and the massive financial fraud, either clearly in writing or clearly on a high-quality audio recording. And we needed them to specifically mention the exact address of my inherited condo while they did it. Art laid out the exact parameters of the legal weapon we needed to forge. He said the confession could not be vague. It could not be a general apology for taking my money. The audio recording or the written document had to contain specific, undeniable details that only the true perpetrators of the crime would know. We needed Jessica to admit that she physically held the blue pen and copied my signature. We needed Brenda to admit that she orchestrated the massive fraud to pay for their lavish lifestyle. Art told me that if I could get that specific confession, he would personally walk it straight to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and bypass the local police department entirely. He promised me he would have federal arrest warrants issued before my mother even had time to realize her perfect life was completely over. but he warned me that securing a confession from a deeply manipulative narcissist was an incredibly dangerous game. Naomi leaned over the marble island, her dark brown eyes entirely focused on the speakerphone. She asked Art exactly how we were supposed to get a calculated criminal like my mother to openly confess to multiple federal felonies. Art's response was simple and utterly terrifying. He told me I had to give them exactly what they wanted. He said toxic, manipulative people like Brenda and Jessica thrived on complete submission and absolute control. They expected me to eventually break down, apologize for my angry outburst in the driveway, and crawl back to them begging for their toxic love. He told me I had to walk right back into the lion's den. I had to go back to my mother's massive suburban house, look her directly in the eye, and pretend that I had completely forgiven them for stealing my entire $28,000 study abroad fund. I had to convince them that I was still the exact same weak, obedient scapegoat daughter they had been exploiting for the last 24 years. The thought of going back to that house made my stomach churn violently. I pictured my mother's smug, disappointed face. I pictured Jessica's cruel, mocking smile as she tossed the keys to her broken-down car onto the concrete driveway. I thought about the heavy manila envelope sitting in the dark safe holding the absolute destruction of my financial future. I told Art that I did not think I could do it. I told him my hands would shake. I told him my voice would crack. I told him my mother would immediately see right through my fake apology and know I was setting a trap. Art's voice softened just a fraction, but the sharp, commanding edge remained. He told me I was entirely wrong. He said narcissists are entirely blinded by their own massive egos. They deeply believe they are smarter than everyone else in the room, especially the people they have successfully abused for years. He said my mother would absolutely believe my fake apology because she desperately wanted to believe that her total control over my life was completely unbroken. Naomi placed her warm hand over mine, gripping my cold fingers tightly. She looked at me with absolute fierce determination. She told me I did not have to do this entirely alone. She said she would be right outside the house in her car the entire time, listening to everything through a secure digital connection. She would be my absolute safety net. She told me this was not just about getting my stolen money back anymore. This was about completely ending the cycle of abuse that had suffocated me my entire life. This was about taking my power back and watching the people who tried to destroy me burn in the massive fire they had carelessly started. Art agreed with her. He told me to go home, get some sleep, and prepare myself mentally for the hardest performance of my entire life. He told me to remember that I was not a weak victim walking into a trap. I was a highly lethal predator walking into a cage completely holding the key. I hung up the phone, and the heavy silence of the early morning settled over the kitchen once again. The massive rainstorm outside had finally stopped, leaving the suburban neighborhood dripping wet and strangely quiet. I looked at the thick yellow legal pads covered in Naomi's sharp handwriting, documenting every single stolen penny and every single forged signature. The crushing heavy terror that had gripped my chest since I saw the $14 bank balance began to slowly recede. It was replaced by a cold, incredibly sharp sense of absolute purpose. I realized Art was entirely right. My mother and sister had spent my entire life completely underestimating my intelligence and ignoring my boundaries. They thought I was nothing more than a convenient financial resource, a reliable tool to be used and discarded whenever they pleased. But they had absolutely no idea what kind of monster they had created. I stood up from the heavy wooden stool, my entire body aching from sheer exhaustion, but my mind completely focused and clear. I looked at Naomi and told her I was ready to build the trap. We spent the next 3 hours carefully going over the exact psychological strategy I would use when I walked back into the house. Naomi warned me that my mother would likely try to gaslight me immediately, telling me that the entire argument in the driveway was my fault for overreacting. She told me I had to completely agree with her. I had to swallow my pride, nod my head, and apologize profusely for being so selfish about my study abroad money. I had to play the role of the desperate daughter seeking maternal approval so perfectly that my mother would completely drop her defensive guard. The plan was incredibly simple, but entirely dangerous. I would go back to the house late tomorrow afternoon. I would put on being my best performance, crying and apologizing for my angry behavior. Once my mother and sister were completely convinced that I had surrendered and accepted the loss of my savings account, I would gently pivot the conversation. I would not mention the forged documents or the $80,000 fraudulent loan directly. That would immediately trigger their suspicion. Instead, I would bring up a completely fake logistical issue regarding my taxes and my stolen study abroad fund. I would tell them I needed Jessica to sign a very basic standard tax release form so I would not get heavily penalized by the Internal Revenue Service for the sudden massive withdrawal from my bank account. But the paper I would hand Jessica would not be a standard tax release form. Naomi and Art were going to legally draft a highly disguised affidavit. It would look like a boring generic tax document covered in complex legal jargon, but buried within the dense paragraphs would be a clear, explicit acknowledgement that Jessica had executed financial documents on my behalf regarding the specific address of my inherited condo. If I could get her to sign that disguised document in front of my mother, the trap would snap completely shut. I would have the exact written confession Art needed to destroy them. And if they refused to sign the paper, I would have a hidden, high-quality micro-recording device taped under my shirt ready to capture every single defensive, angry word they said when I pushed them for the truth. I walked into the small guest bedroom in Naomi's house and collapsed onto the soft mattress. I did not bother taking off my dirty clothes. I just pulled the heavy blanket over my shoulders and stared at the white ceiling. The fear was completely gone now. Tomorrow, I was going back to the house that had suffocated me for 24 years. I was going to look the two women who stole my entire future directly in the eyes, and I was going to smile. I was going to play their twisted, sick game perfectly. But this time, I was holding all the cards, and I was going to make absolutely sure they lost everything. The bright afternoon sun felt completely out of place as I drove my battered grey sedan back toward the affluent suburban neighborhood where I grew up. The violent, heavy rainstorm from the previous night had completely washed the perfectly paved streets clean, leaving behind a crisp, clear day that sharply contrasted with the dark, heavy terror twisting violently inside my stomach. I gripped the worn leather of my steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I was driving straight back into the lion's den. Sitting on the cracked passenger seat right next to my cheap canvas tote bag was a plain brown manila folder. Inside that incredibly unassuming folder was the highly lethal legal weapon that Naomi and Arthur Brooks had spent the entire morning meticulously drafting. It was a completely disguised legal affidavit explicitly acknowledging that Jessica had authorized major financial transactions using my legal identity, specifically tied to the exact address of my inherited starter condo. It was buried deep underneath 5 pages of incredibly dense, boring tax terminology designed to make anyone reading it instantly lose focus and just skip straight to the final signature line. I pulled up to the massive house and parked my old car slightly down the quiet street, avoiding the pristine driveway entirely. My mother's property looked exactly the same as it always did, a perfect, flawless facade, hiding absolute toxic rot underneath. Sitting right in the middle of the wide concrete driveway was the brand new pearl-white Tesla gleaming obnoxiously in the bright sunlight. It was the exact physical manifestation of my completely stolen future. I turned off my struggling engine and sat in the quiet car for a long, heavy moment. I closed my eyes and mentally replayed the strict instructions Naomi had given me just an hour ago. She told me I had to completely swallow my pride. She told me I had to become the absolute perfect, beaten-down, submissive daughter they always demanded me to be. I had to feed their massive narcissistic egos until they were completely blinded by their own arrogant superiority. I picked up the brown folder, shoved it deep inside my canvas tote bag, and stepped out onto the quiet street. 2 blocks away, Naomi was sitting completely still in her unmarked black vehicle, watching a digital tracking application on her phone, completely ready to call the police if anything went physically wrong. I walked slowly up the long brick pathway leading to the heavy oak front door. I did not walk with my usual confident professional posture. I intentionally slumped my shoulders forward, dragging my cheap sneakers slightly on the smooth bricks. I forced my jaw to tremble slightly and commanded a deep, heavy pool of fake, desperate tears to form in the corners of my eyes. I raised my shaking hand and knocked softly on the heavy wood. A few agonizingly long seconds later, the brass deadbolt clicked loudly and the heavy door swung open. My mother, Brenda, stood in the grand entryway wearing a pristine, perfectly pressed white silk blouse and holding a tall crystal glass of iced lemon water. Her initial expression was immediately hard and completely defensive. Her dark eyes narrowed sharply and her entire posture stiffened as she prepared to engage in another massive screaming match to defend her precious golden child. I did not give her a single second to speak. I immediately dropped my gaze to the polished hardwood floor and let out a shaky, pathetic sigh that I had practiced perfectly in the mirror that morning. I told her I was so incredibly sorry. I let my voice crack perfectly on the final word, allowing a single real tear to spill over my eyelashes and roll slowly down my cheek. I slowly looked up at her and told her I had been awake all night, completely sick with deep, heavy guilt over how violently and disrespectfully I had reacted in the driveway yesterday. I said I was just so exhausted from working endless overtime hours at the medical data facility that I had completely lost my mind and thrown a terrible, selfish, childish tantrum. I told her she was absolutely right about everything. I said family always comes first, no matter what, and I should be deeply, profoundly proud to help my own twin sister succeed in her new competitive real estate career. I wiped my wet cheek with the back of my trembling hand and whispered that I was just so sorry for being such a selfish, ungrateful daughter to a mother who only ever wanted the absolute best for our family. My mother stared at me for a long, heavy, agonizing moment. The grand hallway was completely silent, except for the faint humming of the massive central air conditioning unit. I could literally see the complex gears turning behind her dark eyes as her deeply ingrained narcissistic ego aggressively absorbed my complete and total submission. She loved nothing more in this entire world than being absolutely right, and my pathetic, desperate apology fed her toxic superiority complex perfectly. Her rigid defensive posture completely melted away like ice on a hot stove. A slow, incredibly smug and deeply satisfied smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. She took a step back and opened the heavy oak door completely wide, gesturing gracefully for me to finally come inside the house. She told me, in her most fake, patronizing maternal voice, that she was very glad I had finally come to my senses and realized how completely ridiculous I was acting. She led me down the long, wide hallway and straight into the massive custom-built kitchen. Jessica was sitting casually at the massive white marble island, typing aggressively on her expensive silver laptop while sipping a bright pink iced coffee. Jessica looked up from her bright screen and immediately rolled her perfectly manicured eyes when she saw my red tear-stained face and my pathetic slumped posture. My mother walked proudly over to the expensive stainless steel refrigerator and casually announced to the room that I had come crawling back to deeply apologize for my massive, embarrassing emotional meltdown. Jessica let out a sharp, cruel, condescending laugh and slammed her expensive laptop completely shut. She looked me up and down with absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. She told me it was definitely about time I grew up and stopped acting like a massive, pathetic, jealous loser. She actually had the absolute stunning audacity to look me dead in the eye and tell me that if I just applied myself a little bit more and worked significantly harder at my boring little data entry jobs, I might eventually be able to afford a nice luxury car too. She aggressively bragged that her new white electric vehicle was already attracting high-end wealthy clients to her professional real estate social media pages, and that my tiny little insignificant study abroad fund was just a necessary financial sacrifice for the greater good of the Bennett family brand. I stood there frozen in the absolute center of the massive expensive kitchen, digging my short fingernails so deeply into the soft palms of my hands that I almost broke the skin. I violently swallowed every single ounce of my personal pride and simply nodded my head in complete, total, pathetic agreement. I looked directly at Jessica and told her she was completely right about everything. I said her blooming, lucrative career was obviously significantly more important than my silly little educational vacation to Europe. My mother walked over and placed a heavy, patronizing hand directly on my shoulder, softly patting my back like I was a highly obedient, simple-minded dog that had finally learned a difficult new trick. She looked at me with a completely fake warm smile and told me she completely forgave me. She said we could just put this entire ugly, unfortunate situation behind us permanently and move forward as a happy, successful, united family. That was the exact absolute moment I desperately needed. The absolute highest peak of their completely blind, arrogant overconfidence. I let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of deep, profound relief and offered them both a weak, trembling, grateful smile. I told them I was so incredibly relieved they were finally willing to forgive me because I was honestly absolutely terrified to come over here today and face them. I shifted my weight nervously from foot to foot and reached slowly inside the plain canvas tote bag hanging off my left shoulder. I kept my voice incredibly soft and completely non-threatening. I told them there was just one tiny little boring administrative problem we urgently needed to quickly resolve regarding the massive bank withdrawal from my savings account. I pulled the boring brown manila folder out of my canvas bag and laid it gently on the pristine white marble counter directly in front of Jessica. Both of their completely smug expressions faltered slightly for a tiny microscopic fraction of a second. My mother immediately crossed her arms tightly over her chest and demanded to know exactly what kind of problem I was talking about. I poured every single ounce of fake frantic panic into my voice. I explained that because the $28,000 was officially registered strictly under my primary personal social security number, the sudden massive wire transfer triggered an automatic severe alert with the Federal Internal Revenue Service. I told them the federal government was planning to heavily penalize me for an early, unapproved massive withdrawal, unless I could quickly provide a basic standard release form proving the exact money was transferred directly to an immediate family member for a certified professional business expense. I told my mother with tears aggressively welling in my eyes that I absolutely could not afford to pay a massive federal tax penalty on top of completely losing my entire savings account. I begged them both to just please help me out with this one tiny, boring piece of bureaucratic paperwork so the aggressive federal government would finally leave me alone. Jessica looked incredibly annoyed and deeply inconvenienced. She stared at the thick stack of papers resting on the cold marble counter like it was a pile of literal toxic garbage. She aggressively complained that she was completely exhausted from heavy professional networking all morning, and she absolutely hated dealing with boring, complex financial taxes. She loudly asked me why I always had to make things so incredibly difficult and complicated for everyone else in the family. I immediately apologized profusely, again, physically shrinking back and looking directly down at the polished hardwood floor. I told her I knew it was incredibly annoying, but it was just a strict, mandatory federal requirement, and it would realistically only take her 2 seconds to sign her name on the bottom line. I reached carefully into my jacket pocket and pulled out a simple blue ballpoint pen, placing it right next to the thick printed documents. I carefully opened the brown folder and quickly flipped past the first 4 pages of dense, confusing legal jargon that Naomi and Art had intentionally drafted to completely mask the true devastating nature of the document. I pointed directly to the final white page where a clean, solid black line waited patiently for her signature. I told her the document simply stated that she officially acknowledged receiving the massive funds for her professional vehicle purchase, so the heavy tax burden would not fall entirely on my incredibly empty bank account. My mother leaned heavily over the marble island and completely squinted at the complex legal text printed perfectly on the white paper. For one terrifying, agonizing second, my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. I thought she was actually going to pick up the heavy document and read the dense paragraphs carefully. If she read the exact text, she would clearly see the specific property address of my inherited starter condo explicitly listed in the legally binding words. She would easily see the explicit, clear admission of utilizing my legal identity to commit massive financial fraud. The entire trap would completely explode right in my face, and I would lose absolutely everything forever. I held my breath, forcing my face to remain completely perfectly blank and submissive. My mother stared at the dense dark words for a few excruciating seconds before letting out a loud, heavy sigh of complete, total boredom. She turned to Jessica and told her to just sign the stupid paper so I would stop whining and finally leave them alone to enjoy their peaceful, luxurious afternoon. Jessica let out a loud, dramatic groan of pure, intense annoyance. She grabbed the blue pen firmly from the marble counter, completely ready to sign her own absolute destruction. Jessica held the blue ballpoint pen hovering less than an inch above the solid black signature line on the pristine white paper. I stopped breathing entirely. The massive kitchen was completely silent, except for the low hum of the expensive stainless steel refrigerator. My heart was slamming violently against my ribs like a trapped animal trying to escape my chest. Just one quick, careless scribble of her incredibly flamboyant handwriting, and the entire nightmare would be legally over. I would have the exact written confession Arthur Brooks needed to bypass the local police and send federal investigators directly to their front door. I kept my eyes completely glued to the hardwood floor, playing the role of the terrified, submissive daughter to absolute perfection, but my peripheral vision was locked intensely on her manicured fingers. I watched the tip of the blue pen descend toward the paper. I could almost taste the sweet, heavy victory, but then the pen suddenly stopped. It froze completely midair. Jessica slowly pulled her hand back and dropped the blue pen onto the marble counter. It hit the hard stone surface with a loud, sharp clatter that sounded like a gunshot in my ringing ears. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and narrowed her eyes at the dense legal paragraphs printed above the signature line. She let out a loud, irritated scoff and shook her head. She firmly announced that she was absolutely not signing a single thing today. She loudly claimed that she had just watched a terrifying investigative documentary on federal revenue taxes last week, and she knew for an absolute fact that putting her signature on any government financial form would instantly trigger a massive audit on her pristine new real estate business. She angrily accused me of maliciously trying to drag her flawless professional reputation down into my chaotic, messy financial problems. She looked at me with absolute pure disgust and said I was incredibly selfish for even asking her to take any kind of legal responsibility for a bank account that belonged entirely to me. My mother, who had been staring blankly out the window just a second ago, suddenly snapped her attention back to the kitchen island. Her maternal protective instincts flared up instantly the moment she thought her precious golden child was being slightly inconvenienced. She stepped aggressively closer to the counter and snatched the brown manila folder away from Jessica before I could even say a single word. She slammed the folder shut completely, hiding the disguised legal affidavit. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my face and told me I was completely out of line. She loudly reprimanded me for trying to force my highly successful sister to sign confusing, binding legal documents without a corporate attorney present. She forcefully shoved the entire brown folder straight back into my cheap canvas tote bag and told me I needed to handle my own financial mistakes like a responsible, independent adult. The trap had completely failed. My brilliant, airtight legal strategy shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces right there on the pristine marble island. A violent wave of pure, blinding panic rose instantly in my dry throat, but I violently forced my facial muscles to remain perfectly calm and deeply submissive. I could not let them see the absolute terror flashing in my eyes. I knew with absolute certainty that if I pushed the issue even a tiny fraction of an inch, they would become deeply suspicious, and my one single chance to legally destroy them would vanish into thin air forever. Art had specifically warned me about this exact scenario. He told me that narcissists were highly unpredictable and inherently paranoid about anything that threatened their fake, perfect image. I immediately backed down completely. I held up my shaking hands in a gesture of total pathetic surrender and apologized profusely. I let a fake, desperate sob catch in my throat and told them they were absolutely right. I lied and said I was just so overly stressed and terrified about the federal tax penalties that I completely lost my mind and stopped thinking clearly. I promised them I would never ask for their help again, and I would figure out another way to handle the Internal Revenue Service entirely on my own. My mother gave a slow, highly smug, satisfied nod. She crossed her arms triumphantly and looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and deep superiority. She told me that taking personal accountability was exactly what a mature adult should do. She told me to stop constantly relying on the family to constantly clean up my chaotic messes and to finally take control of my pathetic little life. I swallowed the thick, bitter bile rising in my throat and nodded obediently, keeping my head bowed low. I needed to pivot to Plan B immediately. Naomi had heavily anticipated that the written affidavit might fail, so she had carefully prepared a secondary physical weapon just in case. Taped securely to my ribs directly underneath my thick, oversized denim jacket was a tiny micro-recording device provided by her elite private investigator contact. But I could not just record a basic, boring conversation in the kitchen and take it to the police. I needed to leave the device permanently hidden inside the house and actively trigger them to talk openly about the forged $80,000 mortgage documents while I was not physically in the room. I desperately needed a massive chaotic distraction to plant the audio bug safely. I did not have to wait very long for the universe to deliver one. Jessica's expensive smartphone suddenly buzzed loudly against the marble counter, vibrating with an incoming call. She snatched it up, looked at the caller identification screen, and let out a dramatic, irritated groan that echoed through the large kitchen. She answered the phone with a sharp, aggressive tone, demanding to know why she was being bothered on her private day off. She put the call on speakerphone and announced loudly to the room that the luxury catering company she hired for her upcoming real estate launch and networking gala was threatening to completely cancel her event. The highly anticipated networking gala was Jessica's absolute current obsession. It was supposed to be her massive grand entrance into the high-end suburban property market. She was throwing a lavish, incredibly expensive party at a rented luxury venue next weekend to mingle with wealthy property investors and heavily show off her completely fake financial success. The catering manager on the other end of the line sounded incredibly tired and highly annoyed. He firmly stated that they were absolutely refusing to upgrade her basic menu to the premium imported seafood package without an immediate massive additional cash deposit. Instantly, the boring, annoying tax conversation with me was completely forgotten. My mother rushed over to Jessica's side, and the two of them began frantically arguing over the catering logistics. They completely ignored my presence in the room. My mother aggressively argued that serving a basic chicken dinner would make them look incredibly desperate and cheap to the wealthy investors, while Jessica screamed that cutting the imported crystal champagne budget to afford the expensive lobster appetizers would entirely ruin her elite luxury brand aesthetic. They were completely absorbed in their ridiculous superficial crisis, yelling at each other, and the poor catering manager about crystal glassware, floral table centerpieces, and the exact shade of the cocktail napkins. The sheer absolute absurdity of them fighting violently over expensive lobster appetizers, while they were actively committing massive federal mortgage fraud, was entirely mind-blowing. But this was my exact perfect window of opportunity. I slowly took a quiet, careful step backward, moving away from the bright overhead lights of the kitchen island. I pretended to accidentally drop my cheap metal car keys onto the polished hardwood floor. They hit the solid ground with a loud, sharp jingle, but my mother and sister did not even flinch or turn their heads. They were way too busy shouting at the exhausted catering manager on the speakerphone. I dropped down onto my hands and knees, sliding perfectly underneath the massive overhang of the white marble kitchen island. The dark space was completely hidden from view by the tall, heavy wooden bar stools lining the counter. My hands were shaking wildly as I reached under my denim jacket and quickly unpeeled the tiny black circular recording device from my ribcage. It pulled painfully at my skin, but I ignored the sharp sting. The device was incredibly small, no bigger than a standard coin, but Naomi had promised me it possessed highly advanced audio technology that could easily pick up a quiet whisper from completely across the massive room. I reached my trembling hand up and pressed the strong adhesive backing of the small microphone firmly against the rough, unfinished underside of the heavy marble counter. I placed it directly above the middle bar stool where my mother always sat to drink her morning coffee and loudly discuss her daily plans. I pressed the tiny plastic device into the stone for 3 agonizing seconds, making absolutely sure it was permanently and securely attached. I used my thumbnail to press the microscopic activation button hidden on the side of the black casing. A tiny invisible green light flashed exactly once before going completely dark. The audio trap was officially set and armed. I grabbed my car keys off the hardwood floor and stood back up smoothly, brushing the invisible dust off my denim jeans. I slung my cheap canvas tote bag over my shoulder and quietly walked backward toward the kitchen archway. Neither of my family members had even noticed I went under the counter. They were still aggressively screaming about the severe lack of jumbo shrimp on the menu. I did not say goodbye. I simply turned around and walked straight out the heavy oak front door, leaving the silent, invisible weapon behind to entirely destroy their lives. The drive from my cramped city apartment to my mother's sprawling suburban house usually took 45 minutes in evening traffic. I made the trip in 22 minutes. I do not remember stopping at any red lights, and I do not remember the music playing on the radio. All I remember is the burning sensation tightening in my chest and the white knuckle grip I maintained on the steering wheel of my rusty sedan. Every single time I blinked, I saw that glowing digital bank balance burned into the back of my eyelids. $14.50. My entire future wiped out in a single afternoon. I had sacrificed my 20s for that money. While my friends were going out to bars on Friday nights, I was sitting in my dark living room coding medical data until 3 in the morning. I ate cheap noodles for months. I wore sweaters with holes in the sleeves because I refused to spend a single dime on myself. Every deposit into that savings account was a brick in the foundation of my escape plan. Florence was not just a study abroad program to me. It was my chance to study architectural history among the greatest buildings in the world. It was my chance to finally breathe. And my own mother had walked into a bank and stolen it all. I pulled into the pristine neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly manicured by hired landscapers, and the houses all looked like they belonged in a luxury real estate magazine. I slammed my heavy foot on the brakes as I reached my mother's long paved driveway. I did not even bother pulling in properly or checking my mirrors. I left my car parked at a crooked, aggressive angle, half on the street and half on the pristine concrete. I shoved the heavy gear shift into park and threw my driver's side door open before the struggling engine even fully died. I hit the ground running, but I did not even make it to the front steps. I froze completely dead in my tracks. There it was, sitting right in the middle of the wide driveway, gleaming under the amber glow of the evening streetlights, was a brand new pearl-white Tesla Model Y. It still had the temporary paper dealer plates taped to the back window. The car was immaculate and completely out of place next to my rusted-out vehicle. And draped across the curved hood of the expensive machine, like she was starring in a high-budget luxury commercial, was my twin sister, Jessica. She was wearing a designer silk blouse and holding her expensive phone out on an extended tripod, recording herself. I could hear her fake, overly enthusiastic customer service voice echoing in the quiet suburban air. She was talking to her social media followers about manifesting success and upgrading her real estate brand to attract high net worth clients. She was bragging about the dual motor and the white vegan leather interior. She was quite literally posing on top of my stolen study abroad fund and packaging it as her own hard-earned success. I slammed my car door shut with enough force to rattle the windows of the neighboring houses. The loud metallic crack echoed through the driveway. Jessica stopped her video recording and turned to look at me. She did not look guilty. She did not look panicked. She did not even have the common decency to look ashamed. She just rolled her eyes heavily, like I was an annoying neighbor interrupting her important professional photo shoot. I walked straight up to her. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to ball them into tight fists at my sides to hide the tremors. I asked her where she got the money for the car. My voice was low, but it was vibrating with a dangerous rage I had never felt before in my entire life. Jessica hopped off the hood of the car, smoothing down her pristine skirt with carefully manicured fingers. She gave an exaggerated, loud sigh and told me to calm down because I was ruining her sunset lighting. She casually flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and said she financed the car and mother just helped her with the necessary down payment. The down payment, $28,000. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, and screamed that it was not mother's money to give. It was my money. It was the money I saved working miserable overnight shifts while she was sleeping in until noon every single day. Before Jessica could even formulate a smug response, the heavy oak front door of the main house swung open. My mother, Brenda, marched out onto the wide front porch. She was wearing her usual expensive cashmere cardigan and a look of deep, profound disappointment. She did not ask me why I was screaming in the driveway. She did not ask me how I was doing or if I was okay. She walked down the brick steps and stood directly between me and Jessica like she was physically protecting a helpless innocent victim from a raging monster. She looked at me with cold eyes and told me to immediately lower my voice because the neighbors were home and I was causing an embarrassing scene. I completely ignored her command. I pointed a shaking finger at the glaring white car and demanded to know how she could walk into a bank, look a teller in the face, and wire my absolute life savings to a car dealership. My mother crossed her arms over her chest and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh. She looked at me with this perfectly practiced expression of pity mixed with extreme annoyance. She told me that I was blowing things entirely out of proportion as usual. She said Jessica had just received her real estate license and she desperately needed a reliable luxury vehicle to drive her wealthy prospective clients to million-dollar property viewings. She actually looked me dead in the eye and said Jessica needed to look highly successful in order to be highly successful. She called it a necessary career investment. I stared at her in total disbelief. I held up my two hands, shoving them right in front of her face. I forced her to look at my hands. The skin on my fingers was cracked, peeling, and completely dry from constantly typing and sanitizing at the medical data facility. I pointed fiercely to the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes that no amount of cheap drugstore concealer could ever hide. I asked her if she had any concept of what I went through to save that specific amount of money. I told her about the missed meals, the 60-hour work weeks, the sheer bone-deep exhaustion that had become my entire personality over the last 3 years. I told her I was suffocating under the weight of my own life just to buy a ticket out. Then I aggressively pointed at Jessica. Her nails were freshly manicured in a perfect expensive French tip. Her hair was blown out into flawless golden waves. Her skin was glowing from professional spa treatments. She had never worked more than 20 hours a week in her entire privileged life. She lived completely rent-free in my mother's massive house while I paid their monthly utility bills from my tiny roach-infested studio apartment. I paid their heating bill in the winter so they would stay warm while I slept in multiple sweaters. I asked my mother how she could steal my dream program in Italy just to buy her favorite golden child an electric toy. My mother's face instantly hardened. All the fake maternal pity vanished from her features, replaced by a sharp, nasty glare. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest and told me I was being incredibly selfish and immature. She said I was young and I could just study abroad next year or the year after that. She said family always comes first and I should be incredibly proud to support my twin sister's blooming career. She actually used the word proud. She said I was always so terribly stubborn and unwilling to see the bigger picture of our family's success. She told me the money was just sitting in a joint bank account, doing absolutely nothing productive, while Jessica had a massive real emergency. A real emergency. That is what she called wanting a shiny new Tesla to impress strangers on the internet. She told me I needed to grow up, act my age, and stop throwing a massive temper tantrum over money that was technically legally in her name too. I stood there, frozen, staring at the two women who shared my exact DNA. I realized in that exact horrifying moment that they did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They never had. They saw me as a financial resource. They saw me as a reliable bank account they could raid whenever they wanted to fund their lifestyle. I felt a hot, painful sting of tears welling up in the corners of my eyes, but I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted metallic blood. I absolutely refused to cry in front of them. I refused to give them the immense satisfaction of seeing me break down in their driveway. Jessica let out a short, high-pitched, condescending laugh. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a heavy metal keyring. It had a faded, cheap plastic keychain attached to it. She tossed the keys through the warm evening air. They hit my chest hard and clattered loudly onto the concrete driveway between my cheap, worn-out sneakers. Jessica smiled a cruel, mocking smile that did not reach her eyes. She pointed her finger down the street to a dented gray car parked illegally by the fire hydrant. It was her old 2008 Honda Civic, the one with the broken air conditioning system and the failing transmission that slipped violently every time you drove over 40 miles an hour. She looked at me with total disgust and told me that since I was so stressed about transportation and money, I could just take her awful hand-me-down. She said it was perfectly fine for getting to my little data entry jobs in the city. She said I should be getting down on my knees and thanking her for giving me a free car instead of acting like a jealous monster. My mother nodded in firm agreement, like this was a perfectly reasonable, generous compromise for stealing $28,000 from her own child. I looked down at the dirty keys lying on the concrete. Then I looked at the pristine white Tesla. Finally, I looked directly into the eyes of the two women standing in the driveway. The loud, frantic anger inside my chest suddenly went completely cold and silent. It was no longer a screaming rage. It was a quiet, calculated, absolute certainty. I did not bend down to pick up the keys. I did not say another single word to either of them. I stepped gracefully around my mother and marched straight up the brick porch steps. I pushed the heavy front door open and walked into the house I grew up in. I knew I had a locked box of important legal childhood documents and irreplaceable keepsakes hidden in the closet of my old bedroom. I was going to pack my things and I was going to leave this toxic family behind forever. They thought I was just going to roll over and accept this defeat, but they made a massive fatal mistake. I was finally free to destroy them. I sat inside my hot, suffocating car, parked 3 blocks away from my mother's house. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my joints ached, but I did not dare turn the engine on. I stared intensely at the bright screen of my smartphone. The secure digital application Naomi had installed was actively syncing with the tiny microphone hidden beneath the marble kitchen island. For the first 20 minutes, all I heard through my car speakers was the aggressive, endless arguing about the luxury catering menu. Jessica was screaming about the absolute necessity of imported lobster, while my mother was desperately trying to calculate the remaining balance on her maxed-out credit cards. It was infuriating to listen to them complain about minor party details while my entire financial life was actively burning to the ground. But I forced myself to be patient. I sat perfectly still in the sweltering heat and waited for the trap to snap shut. Finally, the catering manager hung up the phone. A heavy, tense silence fell over the kitchen. I leaned closer to the car speakers, holding my breath. It was my mother who spoke first. Her voice was low and filled with a sharp, bitter annoyance. She told Jessica that she needed to seriously calm down about the party budget because they were completely out of liquid cash. Jessica immediately fired back her tone, completely dripping with entitled outrage. She loudly reminded our mother that the real estate networking gala was the entire reason they went through the massive hassle of stealing my identity in the first place. My heart completely stopped beating. I reached out and tapped the record button on the application, making absolutely sure every single word was saved directly to my secure cloud storage. Jessica continued her angry rant, completely unaware that she was handing me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. She aggressively complained that her right hand had physically cramped from having to practice my signature for 3 hours straight before she finally got the loops of the M and the Y perfectly right on the home equity documents. She whined that forging an $80,000 federal bank loan was the most stressful thing she had ever done in her entire life. My mother instantly shushed her, telling her to keep her voice down, even though they were completely alone in the house. My mother then arrogantly bragged that the massive financial risk was entirely worth it. She explicitly stated that bribing the corrupt local notary to verify the fake signatures had cost her $500 in pure cash, but it successfully kept the bank from asking any difficult questions about my physical absence. Then came the absolute final nail in their criminal coffin. Jessica asked what they were going to do when the bank eventually foreclosed on my inherited condo because they could no longer afford the massive monthly payments. My mother let out a cold, ruthless laugh that sent a massive, violent shiver straight down my spine. She casually replied that they would just completely deny everything. She said they had already successfully drained my $28,000 study abroad fund to pay the past due arrears and secure the shiny new Tesla. She told Jessica that when the federal fraud investigators inevitably showed up, they would simply throw me directly under the bus. She said Maya is weak and completely unstable. The police will absolutely believe she signed the papers herself and just forgot about it. My mother literally planned to let me go to a federal penitentiary so her golden child could drive a luxury car and eat imported lobster. I did not wait to hear another single word. I violently shoved my car into drive and sped away from the affluent suburban neighborhood. I drove straight back to Naomi's house, running through 2 yellow lights in my absolute desperate rush to get back to the war room. When I burst through her front door, Naomi was already sitting at the massive mahogany dining table. I did not say a single word to her. I just threw my phone onto the wooden table and hit the play button, turning the volume all the way up. Naomi sat perfectly still, listening to the crystal clear, high-definition audio recording of my family casually plotting my total, absolute destruction. When the recording finished and my mother's cold, ruthless laugh faded into the quiet room, Naomi looked up at me. Her brown eyes were blazing with a terrifying dark fire. She picked up her own phone and immediately dialed Arthur Brooks. Art answered on the first ring. Naomi put him on speakerphone and played the entire audio file directly into the receiver. For a long, agonizing moment, the line was completely silent. Then Art let out a deep, genuine laugh. It was the exact sound of a brilliant predator watching his prey walk willingly into a steel cage. He told us the confession was absolutely flawless. He said it was not just a basic admission of guilt. It was a perfectly detailed step-by-step tutorial on exactly how they committed massive federal wire fraud, identity theft, and felony forgery. They had explicitly named the loan amount, they had admitted to bribing a licensed public official, and they had confessed to stealing my personal savings to cover their tracks. Art said this was no longer a messy suburban family dispute. This was a slam-dunk federal prosecution. Art immediately shifted into pure, ruthless attack mode. He told us he was bypassing the local beat cops entirely. He had a direct personal contact inside the major financial crimes division of the regional police department. He said a detective friend of his had been actively looking for a solid open and shut fraud case to boost his quarterly prosecution numbers. And my mother just handed him the absolute perfect wrapped gift. Art instructed me to immediately email him the secure audio file and all the high-resolution photographs of the forged documents. He promised to have the official criminal warrants drafted and signed by a judge within the next 48 hours. But Art was not completely finished. He wanted to ensure they lost absolutely everything before the handcuffs even clicked around their wrists. He asked Naomi to pull up the exact corporate contact information for the massive luxury vehicle dealership where Jessica had purchased the Tesla. Art explained the beautiful, brutal reality of asset forfeiture laws. Because my mother had specifically wired the stolen $28,000 to clear the fraudulent mortgage default and secure the necessary credit approval, the Tesla was technically purchased using the direct proceeds of a federal financial crime. That meant the car was actively considered stolen property by the federal government. Art personally dialed the direct line to the elite fraud and loss prevention department of the luxury dealership. He confidently introduced himself as a former federal prosecutor representing the primary victim of a massive identity theft ring. I sat there in absolute awe as Art completely dismantled Jessica's fake wealthy facade with a single 5-minute phone call. He calmly informed the corporate fraud director that the down payment for the white Model Y had been entirely laundered through a severely defaulted and completely fraudulent home equity line of credit. He provided the exact routing numbers Naomi had traced and offered to immediately send over the recorded audio confession proving the severe federal crimes. The corporate director on the other end of the phone was absolutely horrified. Luxury dealerships absolutely hate being tied to federal money laundering investigations. The director immediately flagged Jessica's brand new vehicle financing account for severe critical fraud. He assured Art that the dealership would exercise their immediate legal right to heavily repossess the stolen vehicle. The trap was now completely fully armed. We had the police, we had the federal evidence, and we had the massive corporate dealership all aiming their massive weapons directly at my mother and sister. But I did not want them to just be quietly arrested in their living room on a random Tuesday morning. I wanted them to feel the exact same absolute crushing public humiliation they had forced me to endure my entire life. I wanted their entire fake suburban social circle to witness exactly who they truly were behind closed doors. I looked at Naomi and I looked at the phone sitting on the table. I told Art that Jessica was hosting a massive, highly publicized real estate networking gala next Friday night. I told him she had invited over 100 wealthy property investors, local socialites, and elite suburban influencers to celebrate her completely fake success. I told Art I wanted the arrest warrants executed right in the middle of her precious luxury party. I wanted the heavy police cruisers to pull up while she was giving her arrogant toast. I wanted the repo men to drag that shiny white Tesla out of the venue parking lot while all of her wealthy prospective clients watched in absolute total disgust. Art was completely silent for a second before he let out an impressed low whistle. He told me I was absolutely ruthless and he completely loved it. He said coordinating a public strike with the Financial Crimes Division would require a few precise logistical maneuvers, but he guaranteed he could make it happen. He said the detectives would absolutely love the dramatic element of surprise because it heavily prevented the suspects from destroying any physical evidence hidden inside their house while they were away at the party. We spent the next 3 hours finalizing the exact brutal timeline of the strike. Naomi successfully transferred all the digital evidence onto heavily encrypted, secure drives for the police department. Art drafted the formal legal declarations I needed to sign to officially press severe federal charges against my own mother and sister. My hand did not shake for a single second when I signed my real, genuine signature at the bottom of the heavy legal paperwork. I did not feel an ounce of sadness or regret. The weak, obedient daughter who cried in the driveway was completely dead and gone. I was a completely, entirely new person, forged in the exact massive fire they had carelessly started. The bomb was perfectly armed, the timer was aggressively ticking down, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the massive explosion coming their way. Naomi poured us both a large glass of expensive red wine to celebrate the flawless execution of our trap. We sat in her beautiful warm kitchen, raising our crystal glasses in a silent, powerful toast. I finally took a deep, full breath of air, feeling the heavy, crushing weight of the last 3 years completely lift off my tired shoulders. My mother and sister were currently sleeping soundly in their massive suburban house, dreaming about imported lobster and luxury real estate deals. They thought they had successfully ruined my life and secured their perfect, wealthy future. They had absolutely no idea that next Friday night, their entire carefully constructed universe was going to violently collapse around them in front of absolutely everyone they desperately wanted to impress. I took a slow sip of the dark wine and smiled. The absolute best part of the entire story was just about to begin. Friday night arrived with a cool, crisp breeze sweeping through the city, clearing away the heavy humidity of the past week. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in Naomi's guest bedroom, and I honestly could not recognize the woman staring back at me. For the last 3 agonizing years, my entire daily wardrobe had consisted of oversized gray sweatshirts, cheap faded denim jeans, and worn-out scuffed sneakers. I had constantly walked around with my head bowed low, trying desperately to make myself as physically small and entirely invisible as possible. I was the reliable workhorse who never complained and never demanded any attention. But tonight, I was absolutely not hiding in the shadows. Naomi had firmly insisted on taking me shopping earlier that afternoon, refusing to let me wear any of my old clothes. She bought me a sleek, tailored emerald green cocktail dress that fit my body perfectly, paired with incredibly sharp black stiletto heels. My dark hair was professionally styled in smooth, sleek waves cascading over my shoulders, and my makeup was completely immaculate. I did not look like the exhausted, terrified medical data analyst who had cried hysterically over a $14 bank balance just a few days ago. I looked immensely powerful. I looked incredibly dangerous. I looked exactly like a woman who was fully prepared to completely dismantle a massive criminal empire piece by piece. I grabbed my small black clutch purse containing my phone and walked slowly down the stairs. Naomi was waiting by the heavy front door wearing a stunning navy blue corporate pantsuit, looking like a ruthless executive. She gave me a firm, proud nod of approval. We drove to the venue in absolute tense silence. The heavy anticipation filling the car was thick and fiercely electric. Jessica had rented out the grand ballroom of a highly exclusive luxury country club, located right in the absolute center of the most affluent suburban neighborhood in the state. The massive historical stone building was surrounded by perfectly manicured green golf courses and tall ancient oak trees wrapped in twinkling warm fairy lights. As we pulled my rusted gray sedan into the long circular valet driveway, the very first thing I saw was the absolute crowning jewel of her ridiculous vanity project. Parked directly next to the main entrance, heavily illuminated by bright professional theatrical spotlights, was the brand new pearl-white Tesla Model Y. Someone had actually taken the incredibly obnoxious time to drape a massive, thick red velvet ribbon horizontally across the sleek hood. It was put on grand display like a priceless museum exhibit to boldly declare Jessica's completely fake financial success to every single wealthy property investor walking through those heavy glass doors. I stared at the shiny, pristine white paint and felt a sudden sharp spike of pure adrenaline rush through my veins. Just 1 week ago, looking at that expensive car made me want to collapse onto the hard pavement and violently throw up. Tonight, looking at that stolen vehicle just made me smile a cold, hard smile. I knew exactly what was coming. I knew that in less than an hour, that massive red ribbon was going to be aggressively ripped off by a furious, unyielding repo man, and the entire facade would instantly crumble. I handed my old metal car keys to the highly confused teenage valet driver who looked at my terrible car with complete disgust and gracefully walked up the wide stone steps with Naomi right by my side. We pushed through the heavy polished brass and glass doors and stepped directly into the grand ballroom. The massive venue was absolutely packed to the brim with local elite socialites, wealthy suburban influencers, and high-net-worth commercial property investors. Soft, smooth jazz music floated gracefully through the warm air, mingling with the loud, constant clinking of expensive crystal champagne flutes. Waiters in crisp, white tailored tuxedos circulated quickly through the dense crowd carrying heavy silver trays, loaded with the exact expensive imported lobster appetizers my mother and sister had viciously screamed about over the hidden microphone. I scanned the massive opulent room and spotted my mother almost immediately. Brenda was holding court near a massive roaring marble fireplace, wearing a designer black silk evening gown heavily covered in sparkling hand-sewn sequins. She had a tight, captive circle of wealthy suburban wives gathered completely around her, hanging on her every word. I could easily hear her loud, arrogant voice carrying perfectly over the smooth jazz music. She was loudly bragging about how incredibly successful and brilliant her daughters were. She was actively telling the wealthy women that she had personally raised two incredibly driven, fiercely independent young women. She actually had the stunning absolute audacity to use the word independent while actively defaulting on an $80,000 fraudulent mortgage she had secretly taken out in my legal name. She sipped her expensive wine and laughed a loud fake laugh, completely unaware that her entire world was counting down to absolute zero. I intentionally stayed near the dark back of the grand ballroom, leaning casually against a tall cold stone pillar, holding a tall glass of sparkling water with a fresh lime. I watched like a silent predator as Jessica aggressively worked the massive room. She was wearing an incredibly tight silver designer dress that violently caught the bright overhead chandelier lights every single time she moved her body. She was laughing loudly, touching the expensive suit jackets of older wealthy men, and aggressively handing out her glossy, heavy cardstock real estate business cards to anyone who made brief eye contact with her. She looked so incredibly smug and so completely secure in her stolen luxury lifestyle. She truly believed deep in her dark soul that she had completely won the ultimate prize. She firmly believed she had successfully crushed me beneath her expensive designer heels, and that I was currently sitting alone in my tiny, dark city apartment, crying pathetic tears over my completely ruined study abroad dreams. She thought I was far too weak to ever fight back. Suddenly, the soft jazz music faded completely out into total silence. A bright, blinding white spotlight suddenly illuminated a small elevated wooden stage located at the far end of the grand ballroom. Jessica walked gracefully up the short wooden steps holding a crystal microphone in one hand and a tall, delicate glass of expensive champagne in the other. The entire massive room went completely quiet, turning their full undivided attention directly to the newly licensed real estate star. Jessica confidently tapped the crystal microphone with her perfectly manicured French-tip fingernail, producing a soft, rhythmic thumping sound that echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. She smiled a bright, blinding, completely fake smile at the massive crowd of wealthy investors. She began her grand, arrogant speech by graciously thanking every single person for coming out tonight to celebrate her massive, highly anticipated launch into the competitive luxury property market. She talked passionately about the extreme value of hard work, deep personal dedication, and the massive importance of building a solid, trustworthy professional brand. She actually looked directly at the crowd of influential people and firmly claimed that radical honesty and fierce, unwavering integrity were the absolute core foundational pillars of her brand new real estate business. The sheer horrifying, hypocritical audacity of her empty words made my blood violently boil, but I did not lose my calm iron composure for a single second. This was the exact perfect moment I had been waiting for. I calmly handed my glass of sparkling water to Naomi. I stepped completely away from the dark stone pillar and began walking straight down the absolute center of the massive grand ballroom. My sharp black stiletto heels clicked rhythmically and loudly against the polished hardwood floor, cutting through the quiet room. The dense crowd of wealthy socialites and property investors naturally parted ways to let me through, staring openly at the confident, unfamiliar woman in the striking emerald green dress. They whispered to each other, wondering who I was and why I was interrupting the grand speech. My mother finally spotted me walking down the aisle from her spot across the room. Her smug, arrogant smile vanished instantly. All the color rapidly drained from her perfectly made-up face, replaced by a look of absolute sheer visceral terror. She dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered loudly against the marble floor, but nobody even looked at her. Everyone was completely focused on me. I did not stop walking. I did not hesitate. I walked straight up to the edge of the bright elevated stage, right as Jessica proudly raised her champagne glass for her final grand toast. I climbed the short wooden steps, radiating a cold, terrifying, absolute confidence that completely paralyzed her. Jessica froze entirely mid-sentence, her jaw dropping open in pure absolute shock. I walked right up to the crystal microphone standing directly in front of her. The entire grand ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the absolute explosion. I stood directly in front of my sister, on the brightly lit wooden stage, staring right into her terrified eyes. The massive grand ballroom was completely silent. Over 100 of the most influential wealthy property investors in the city were staring up at us, waiting to see what I was going to say. Jessica held the crystal microphone in her shaking hand. The fake, confident smile had completely melted off her face. Her chest was heaving violently under her tight silver designer dress. She leaned in close to me and hissed through her perfectly white teeth, demanding to know what I was doing up there and telling me to immediately get off her stage. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not say a single word to her. I simply offered her a cold, empty smile and stepped gracefully around her. I walked past the center of the stage toward the small audio-visual control table set up just to the left of the heavy velvet curtains. The young technician running the soundboard had briefly stepped away to grab a drink from the open bar, leaving the complicated equipment completely unattended. Jessica had an enormous white projector screen lowered behind the stage. It was entirely queued up to play a highly expensive, heavily edited promotional video showcasing her completely fake luxury lifestyle and her brilliant new real estate business. I set my small black clutch purse down on the metal table and pulled out my smartphone. I calmly picked up the thick auxiliary cable resting next to the main soundboard mixer. I plugged the metal jack directly into my phone, making sure the connection was perfectly secure. I looked out into the crowd. I could see my mother Brenda pushing her way through the dense circle of wealthy suburban wives. Her face was entirely drained of color, looking like absolute chalk under the warm chandelier lights. She was frantically waving her hands, trying desperately to signal the venue staff to come and physically remove me from the stage. She knew exactly what I was doing. She knew her fragile house of cards was about to violently collapse, but she was entirely too late to stop the massive explosion. I unlocked my phone screen, opened the secure digital audio application, and pressed play. I reached over to the main volume slider on the soundboard and pushed it all the way to the absolute maximum level. The massive, high-definition concert speakers flanking the stage popped loudly for a fraction of a second. And then my mother's voice boomed through the grand ballroom, completely deafening and crystal clear. It was the exact recording from the hidden microphone under the kitchen island. The audio started playing the exact moment my mother told Jessica to calm down, because they were entirely out of liquid cash. The wealthy property investors in the front row physically flinched at the sudden loud volume. The waitstaff carrying the expensive silver trays of imported lobster appetizers completely froze in their tracks. Everyone in the massive room stopped breathing. Then Jessica's recorded voice echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings, angrily complaining that her right hand had physically cramped from having to violently practice my signature for 3 hours straight. Her voice clearly whined about how difficult it was to get the loops of the letters perfectly right on the $80,000 home equity documents. A collective massive gasp ripped through the entire elegant crowd. The clinking of expensive crystal champagne flutes completely stopped. The smooth jazz music was entirely dead. The only sound in the entire luxury country club was the absolute undeniable proof of their severe federal crimes. Jessica dropped the crystal microphone. It hit the hard wooden stage with a loud, terrifying thud that caused feedback to scream through the monitors. But the recorded audio kept playing relentlessly over the noise. I watched Jessica's entire body begin to violently tremble. She covered her mouth with both of her hands, staring out at the massive crowd of wealthy clients she had desperately wanted to impress. They were looking back at her with absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. These were highly successful business people who dealt with massive commercial property contracts every single day. Hearing a newly licensed real estate agent openly confess to forging an $80,000 federal mortgage document was the ultimate professional death sentence. The audio recording continued without any mercy. My mother's arrogant voice clearly bragged to the entire room about bribing a corrupt local notary with $500 in pure cash to legally verify the fake signatures. She bragged about completely bypassing the bank security measures, and then the absolute final blow echoed through the speakers. The room listened in horrifying silence as my mother casually explained her vicious backup plan. Her cold, ruthless recorded laugh filled the elegant space as she explicitly detailed how they had stolen my $28,000 study abroad fund to cover their fraudulent tracks. She clearly stated that when the federal fraud investigators inevitably showed up, they would simply throw me directly under the bus because I was weak and completely unstable. She told Jessica they would let me take the total fall and go to a federal penitentiary. My mother tried to scream over the speakers. She ran toward the front of the stage, waving her arms frantically, yelling at the wealthy guests that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She screamed that the audio was completely fake and maliciously manufactured by a deeply jealous, insane daughter. She tried to laugh it off as a sick, twisted joke, but her voice was cracking and her entire body was shaking with violent, sheer terror. Nobody was laughing. The elite suburban wives who had been hanging on her every word just minutes ago were physically taking massive steps backward, getting as far away from her as possible. The wealthy property investors were pulling their expensive smartphones out of their tailored suit pockets, pressing record, and pointing their camera lenses directly at the stage. They were permanently documenting the exact moment the fake Bennett family empire completely burned to the ground. Before my mother could even attempt to climb the short wooden stairs to reach the audio-visual equipment, the massive, heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom flew violently open. The loud crash of the heavy wood hitting the stone walls echoed over the remaining seconds of the audio recording. Everyone in the dense crowd turned their heads toward the back of the room. Naomi stood in the wide doorway, looking like an absolute force of pure, uncompromising justice. She was flanked on either side by two tall, broad-shouldered local police detectives wearing dark professional suits with shiny gold badges prominently clipped to their belts. Walking heavily right behind the detectives were three rugged men wearing dark, heavy canvas work jackets. They were the elite repo crew Art had coordinated with the luxury vehicle dealership. Naomi did not even look at my mother or Jessica. She raised her hand and pointed a single firm finger toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that lined the entire right side of the grand ballroom. The windows provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the brightly lit circular valet driveway. A massive, heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was loudly backing up the pristine stone driveway, its bright yellow reverse lights flashing aggressively against the darkness. The truck stopped directly in front of the pearl-white Tesla. The crowd of wealthy elites rushed toward the massive glass windows, holding their phones up to record the spectacular, absolute humiliation. The repo men walked straight out the front doors and approached the stolen luxury vehicle. Jessica let out a blood-curdling, completely hysterical scream. She completely forgot about the 100 wealthy clients watching her. She forgot about her expensive silver designer dress and her carefully crafted high-end brand. She scrambled awkwardly down the wooden stage stairs and began sprinting across the polished hardwood floor, pushing past the shocked investors. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding that they stop touching her beautiful car. She yelled that she had important wealthy clients to drive around and that the vehicle was legally financed under her pristine real estate business. We all watched through the massive glass windows as one of the rugged repo men grabbed the thick, obnoxious red velvet ribbon draped over the hood. He aggressively ripped it off the expensive paint, tossing the cheap red fabric directly onto the dirty, wet asphalt. He pulled out a heavy metal hook and attached it firmly to the front undercarriage of the white Tesla. The loud screech of the hydraulic lift engaging echoed through the glass as the shiny symbol of her stolen wealth was violently hoisted onto the dirty metal flatbed truck. Jessica reached the heavy glass doors, completely sobbing hysterically, but she never made it outside to save her stolen car. The two local police detectives swiftly stepped directly into her path, physically blocking the exit. Jessica slammed directly into them, her stiletto heels slipping awkwardly on the marble floor. One of the detectives, a stern-looking man with graying hair, grabbed her arm firmly. He did not yell. He spoke in a loud, incredibly clear voice that carried perfectly across the silent ballroom. He stated her full legal name and informed her that she was being placed under official arrest for severe federal wire fraud and multiple counts of felony forgery. Jessica completely collapsed. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she fell onto the hard floor, screaming and violently thrashing like a massive spoiled toddler throwing a catastrophic tantrum. My mother aggressively pushed her way through the crowd of horrified spectators, running toward the detectives. She was completely frantic, her carefully styled hair flying wildly around her face. She tried to use her fake suburban authority, demanding that the officers immediately unhand her daughter. She yelled that they were making a massive, terrible mistake and threatened to aggressively sue the entire police department for severe public harassment. She claimed she knew the local mayor and told the detectives they would both lose their jobs by tomorrow morning. The second detective turned to face her, completely unfazed by her ridiculous, empty, wealthy threats. He looked her up and down with absolute pure professional disgust. He asked her to confirm her name. When she angrily screamed that she was Brenda Bennett, the detective simply nodded his head. He reached to the back of his dark belt and pulled out a second pair of heavy metal handcuffs. He looked directly into her terrified eyes and informed her that she was also being placed under immediate arrest. He loudly listed the massive charges so every single person in her elite social circle could hear them perfectly. Massive structural mortgage fraud, severe identity theft, federal financial conspiracy. My mother stopped screaming entirely. The aggressive, wealthy suburban fight completely drained out of her body, leaving behind nothing but an empty, hollow shell. She looked around the grand ballroom, desperately seeking a single friendly face to defend her. She looked at the elite wives, the wealthy investors, the country club staff. Every single person was staring back at her with absolute cold, unyielding judgment. Her fake, pristine reputation was instantly, permanently dead. The detective grabbed my mother's wrists and pulled them behind her back. The sharp, metallic clicking sound of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists echoed loudly through the room. A second later, the exact same metallic clicking sound confirmed that Jessica was also completely secured. The two women who had spent my entire life violently treating me like an insignificant, disposable piece of garbage were now standing in the middle of a luxury country club, wearing silver handcuffs while 100 people recorded their absolute total destruction. They were crying deeply pathetic tears, begging for someone to help them, but nobody moved a single muscle. I stood calmly on the elevated wooden stage, watching the detectives aggressively escort my mother and my twin sister out the heavy front doors. The massive flatbed tow truck was already pulling away, carrying the white Tesla out into the dark night. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I stepped down from the stage and walked slowly across the empty ballroom floor toward Naomi. The crowd of wealthy elites parted for me again, but this time they were not whispering in confusion. They were looking at me with absolute profound respect. I walked out the heavy glass doors into the cool night air, leaving the absolute wreckage of my toxic family permanently behind me. The nightmare was finally completely over. I had burned their fake empire to the ground, and I was finally entirely free. 6 months later, the warm morning sun of Florence, Italy, felt completely different than the harsh, cold, fluorescent light of my old, cramped city apartment. I was sitting at a small wrought iron table outside a quiet cobblestone cafe located right near the massive ancient cathedral. I lifted a small white porcelain cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of rich, dark espresso. The chaotic, terrifying noise of my past life was completely gone, entirely replaced by the gentle chiming of historical church bells and the soft, beautiful hum of the Italian language surrounding me. I was finally breathing. I was finally living the exact dream I had worked so incredibly hard to build over those 3 miserable, exhausting years. Every single overnight shift, every skipped meal, and every lonely weekend coding medical data had finally paid off in the absolute most spectacular way possible. I watched the local artists setting up their canvases in the vibrant public square, and I felt a profound, deep sense of absolute peace settle into my bones. The road to get to this beautiful cafe over the last 6 months had been incredibly grueling, but entirely worth every single stressful second. Following the massive public arrest at the luxury real estate gala, the local financial crimes division moved with absolute brutal efficiency. Because Arthur Brooks had meticulously secured the crystal-clear audio confession, the massive criminal case against my family was entirely airtight. The major national mortgage lender launched a full internal investigation, immediately halting all aggressive foreclosure proceedings against my inherited property. Once the corrupt local notary completely caved under intense federal pressure and officially testified against my mother, the massive corporate bank formally dissolved the fraudulent $80,000 loan entirely. My legal name was permanently cleared and my pristine credit score was fully restored. And because the luxury vehicle dealership had forcefully repossessed the stolen white Tesla, the federal authorities were able to trace and officially return my entire $28,000 study abroad fund directly back into my secure solo bank account. My late father's final loving gift to me was perfectly safe, and my financial future was completely permanently secured. My mother and my twin sister did not receive a magical, graceful exit from the massive disaster they deliberately created. The local suburban elite community that my mother had desperately worshipped completely turned their backs on her the exact second the shiny metal handcuffs clicked around her wrists in front of all those wealthy investors. Jessica was immediately stripped of her brand new real estate license by the state board before she even had the chance to legally sell a single property. Their massive legal defense fees quickly drained whatever remaining money they had left, forcing my mother to rapidly sell the sprawling suburban house at a massive loss just to pay her high-powered defense attorneys. But all the expensive lawyers in the entire world could not erase the high-definition audio recording of their complete criminal conspiracy. Facing overwhelming, undeniable evidence and the total destruction of their fake public image, both Brenda and Jessica were recently forced to accept a harsh federal plea deal. They are currently awaiting their formal sentencing hearings, and both are facing mandatory federal prison time for massive mortgage fraud and severe identity theft. They are entirely financially ruined and completely, utterly alone. They arrogantly gambled my entire life to buy a fake luxury aesthetic, and they absolutely lost everything. I heard a familiar, loud laugh echo down the narrow cobblestone street, pulling me instantly out of my quiet, reflective thoughts. I looked up and saw Naomi and my older brother Marcus walking arm in arm toward my small cafe table. Marcus was carrying a small rustic paper bag filled with fresh warm Italian pastries, and Naomi was wearing a bright yellow sundress looking incredibly happy and completely relaxed. They had flown halfway across the world just to spend a long, beautiful holiday weekend celebrating my new life with me. When Marcus finally found out exactly what our mother and sister had done to me, he was completely devastated and deeply horrified. He deeply apologized for being entirely blind to their toxic financial abuse for so many years, and he officially permanently cut all ties with them, refusing to even answer their desperate phone calls from the county jail. Naomi pulled out a metal chair and sat directly across from me, reaching over the small table to warmly squeeze my hand. Her strong, firm grip felt exactly like safety. We did not talk about the massive public arrests, the forged legal documents, or the terrible, heavy past. We talked entirely about the future. We talked about my amazing architectural history classes, the beautiful ancient Renaissance buildings I was studying, and the incredible, authentic local food we were going to eat for dinner later that night. I looked at my brother and my brilliant, fierce sister-in-law, and I realized a massive fundamental truth about life. I realized that true family has absolutely nothing to do with shared blood or matching DNA. True family is fiercely protective, completely honest, and deeply unconditionally supportive. True family never treats you like a convenient bank account or a disposable scapegoat. I had finally found my real family, and for the first time in my entire existence, I had finally found myself. If someone tells you that family is family as an excuse to bleed you dry, cut the cord. Loyalty shouldn't cost your future. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. If you've ever had to take your power back from toxic people, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps this channel so much. Drop a comment below with your city and the time you're watching this. I love reading your stories. Remember, your future belongs to you. See you in the next video.